Hey guys, tonight we follow a man who once made the world tremble from a place so quiet you could hear a leaf fall, then funded a war so loud even history had to take notes. We're talking about Pablo Escobar, the king of cocaine, the patron saint of contradictions, the man who feared nothing except the stillness of sleep. Imagine this, the year is 1985. The city of Medellín is lit like a war zone dressed up for Christmas, and deep in the hills, a king paces through a jungle estate filled with hippos, AK-47s, and secrets that whisper louder than thunder. You probably won't survive this bedtime story, because no matter how sleepy you feel, Pablo's world never lets its eyes fully close. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and your local time down in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. His fingers, testing its grain between calloused skin. Fine, white, almost silky. A powder that didn't look like power, but would shape empires, melt consciences, and dig shallow graves in deep soil. He doesn't smile, doesn't speak, just nods once. That's enough. From this moment, his empire stops being a plan and becomes a current, something fluid, unstoppable, without beginning or end. Part 1 begins here, not with gunfire, but with a whisper and a pinch of powder in a jungle no map wants to name. He's 29, already known in too many corners and not enough boardrooms. His influence is spreading, not like a rumor, but like an oil slick, quiet, heavy, and impossible to wash off. The early 1980s are a time of transition for Colombia, a place where entire neighborhoods are built from bribes and politicians wear smiles, stitched from fear. Pablo doesn't need to wear a crown to be king. He just needs to know where the strings are and who's willing to be pulled. Down in Medellín, the slums bloom with fresh concrete and new shoes. Soccer fields rise where rubble once lived. Kids get birthday gifts they didn't know how to wish for. And every favor is a quiet deal, loyalty in exchange for legacy. Don Pablo, they call him. Sometimes El Patron, the saint of the forgotten. People light candles near murals of him, before the blood, before the bombs. He walks the streets occasionally, surrounded by bodyguards, yes, but unafraid. That's part of the image. He's not just buying goodwill, he's investing in myth. But a myth, even a living one, needs structure. So he builds, not just airstrips and jungle labs, but networks so vast that even silence has an echo. Gustavo, ever the tactician, develops what he calls the grid. It's a rotating network of couriers, pilots, safe houses, and middlemen. Redundancy is key. If one man falls, 5 others know nothing. Loyalty is decentralized, but carefully monitored. Every man is watched, discreetly, respectfully, like you'd watch your own reflection in a dangerous mirror. They don't call themselves a cartel yet. That comes later. For now, it's a business, one that's expanding like breath into lungs that didn't know they were starving. They push past Colombia's borders into Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, places where cash outweighs law, and favor is traded like currency. American markets swell with demand. Miami becomes a hub, both glamorous and grim. Cocaine isn't just a drug anymore. It's a culture, a mirror held up to a society too busy partying to see its own rot. And behind it all, Pablo remains quiet. Not shy, strategic. You don't grow thorns before your roots are deep. He sends Gustavo to negotiate with corrupt port officials and El Chopo to persuade doubters. The first American agents begin asking questions, showing up in Bogotá wearing cheap suits and tighter expressions. Pablo watches from afar. He's not ready to confront them yet, but he sees it coming. Every empire grows until it touches the gods or provokes them. He still sleeps lightly, never in the same bed twice. Bulletproof windows, guards trained in 5 different countries, German shepherds, Belgian pistols, Colombian paranoia. And every night, he listens for a sound he can't describe. Not footsteps, not sirens, something deeper. The sound of history tightening its grip. But for now, the world is his. He builds a zoo. Not just animals, symbols, giraffes, hippos, elephants. Creatures who should not exist here, yet thrive because he willed them to. A metaphor in skin and bone. If he can plant Africa in Colombia, what can't he do? He begins financing political campaigns, not overtly, but enough that senators begin asking, what would Escobar think, before casting a vote? He doesn't need office, he has influence, and that's rarer, more potent. He funds hospitals and schools, makes appearances at charity events, shakes hands that tremble slightly. Because everyone, even the rich, knows what it means when the king smiles at you. But the story isn't all smiles. A pilot is caught. He talks, or tries to. A week later, he's found in the Magdalena River, his hands tied with his own shoelaces. The message is clear. But it's not fear Pablo wants to cultivate. It's control. Fear burns too quickly. Control lingers. His men, his sicarios, understand this. They are young, loyal, raised in streets where options come in bullets or promises. They believe in him the way soldiers believe in saints. Some tattoo his name on their arms. Others carry his photo in their wallets. Not for memory, for strength. He gave me a job, one says in an interview years later. He gave me something to lose. The DEA watches, frustrated. They seize shipments, but the flood continues. Each bust is a drop in a tide. In Washington, Escobar's name begins to circulate behind closed doors. A whisper with teeth. A ghost in boardrooms. The CIA considers involvement, but no one quite knows how big he is. Not yet. In Medellín, life splits in two. On one side, poverty, tin roofs, children with hollow eyes, mothers who pray too loudly. On the other, opulence so thick it suffocates. Private villas with imported tiles, American TVs, guards who don't blink. Pablo straddles both worlds. He's the bridge. The contradiction. The storm in a calm sky. He opens a soccer stadium, throws lavish parties, invites local boys to play. One of them becomes a national star. Another becomes a sicario. Luck decides everything. He starts speaking more openly, still careful but with an edge. Reporters take notice. Some praise his charity, others hint at the truth. A journalist writes, Escobar is building a country inside a country. That journalist disappears. Another one takes his place and writes fluff. Balance restored. But Gustavo worries. He sees the cracks forming, the rivals growing bolder, the politicians growing greedier, the public growing suspicious. We need to slow down, he says once. Pablo just shakes his head. Momentum is the only armor. They build more labs, bigger ones. Some deep in the jungle, others hidden beneath legitimate factories. They bribe chemists, hire drivers, infiltrate customs. Blackie continues flying, breaking records, sleeping little. His eyes are red more often than not, but he never misses a drop. Then, a misstep. One shipment doesn't land. A key contact in Nicaragua goes silent. Gustavo sends feelers. What comes back is worse than silence, betrayal. A lieutenant flipped by a rival cartel. Details leaked. A list, maybe. Names. Pablo responds with a raid. Not surgical. Loud. Violent. A message written in fire and gunpowder. Entire compounds leveled. The traitor's family spared. Barely. Children moved to another city, told never to say their name again. It's not mercy. It's calculus. Dead children don't breed fear. Living orphans do. The war begins in whispers, then gunshots, then bombings. One by one, the other cartels test him. One by one, they bleed. But the cost rises. So do the headlines. For the first time, the public begins to see through the myth. They love Don Pablo, yes, but they also love peace. and peace is starting to feel like a dream they can't afford. Still, Pablo doubles down. Always. He funds more candidates, builds more infrastructure, makes promises no government dares to. He creates jobs, enforces justice, his justice. He becomes indispensable. And in being indispensable, he becomes untouchable. But nothing lasts. The Americans increase pressure. Aid is offered in one hand, surveillance in the other. Satellite images show airstrips. Phone taps catch whispers. The net tightens. And still, Pablo builds. In the jungle, he visits a new lab. State-of-the-art, hidden beneath a cattle ranch, guards in camouflage, electric fences, a generator humming like a heartbeat. He walks through it slowly, his shoes clicking on polished concrete. A worker hands him a fresh batch. Purity's 92%, the man says. Pablo nods. He doesn't smile, just presses his thumb into the powder as if marking it with his fingerprint. A signature. A prophecy. Then he says quietly, to no one in particular, "We're only just beginning." And he believes it, even as the night thickens, even as the stars hide, even as the ground begins to tremble beneath the weight of what he's built. The jungle had a rhythm, ancient and unbothered, but now, somewhere deep in its belly, that rhythm was being remixed by generators, the metallic clatter of drums, and the voices of men who spoke in half-sentences in silence. That's where he stood, boots sinking slightly in the wet soil, the hum of mosquitoes orbiting him like satellites. He didn't flinch. This was a sacred place to him now, not because it was holy, but because it held the future in powdered form. The bag was small, transparent. Inside, a white dust that shimmered under the filtered jungle light. A chemist in a stained shirt with calloused hands passed it over. There was no ceremony, no grin, just gravity. Pablo took it, held it up like a man inspecting a newborn's first breath, and nodded. He didn't need to try it. He didn't even need to speak. This was the moment something intangible had become real. Not just a theory or a scheme, but a product, a weapon, a currency. Back in Medellín, word was already spreading. Not about Pablo specifically, but about the stuff. The new dust. Something that made people dance harder, spend faster, stay awake longer than they should. A new kind of ambition wrapped in a party disguise. The streets of Miami, meanwhile, were beginning to glow under neon lights and powdered noses. People were whispering about it in club bathrooms, luxury cars, and on quiet rooftops where the rich went to feel invincible. Pablo didn't care about the glamour, not yet. For him, the appeal was simple. Low weight, high value, limitless demand. You didn't need trucks, you didn't need ships, just a small plane, a quiet field, and a pilot with guts. The margins were obscene, the math was irresistible, so he did what he always did when opportunity knocked. He opened the door wide, counted how many steps it would take to own the building, and started walking. Routes were everything. You couldn't just move product, you had to move it invisibly. The air, the sea, even under the earth. Pablo began sketching paths like an architect of shadows. The maps weren't just maps. They were arteries in a living, breathing organism, and every shipment was a pulse. One of his earliest smuggling runs didn't go as planned. A plane touched down off schedule, too far east. The local contact missed the rendezvous. For hours, the pilot hid in tall grass while dogs barked in the distance. He radioed in, panicked. Pablo's voice came over the line, calm and exact. "Stay still, don't move. Wait for the fog." The fog came. The rescue team found the pilot just as the sun rose. He was shaking but alive. Pablo didn't scold him. He gave him a bonus. Loyalty doesn't grow through fear alone. It needs fertilizer. Gustavo, as always, handled the logistics. He was the quiet calculator, the man who could make fuel, bribes, flight times, and weather patterns dance together in harmony. They'd meet in safe houses over arepas and black coffee, scribbling on napkins and walls. Everything felt improvised, but nothing was. There was always a plan, even if it wasn't written down. The labs grew, not just in number, but in sophistication. What started as rudimentary huts with gasoline stoves and glassware became full-on jungle factories. They imported chemical supplies through fake construction companies, paid off officials to ignore delivery trucks. Everyone got a piece. Everyone learned to shut up. And still they stayed small in presentation. No loud parties, no flashy homes. Not yet. Pablo wore knockoff shoes and drove an old car. He didn't want attention. He wanted time. But time, like everything else, had a price. The more routes they opened, the more rivals they attracted. Some were small-time smugglers, others ex-military, and some were just desperate men with big ideas and no patience. One group tried to undercut him by stealing a shipment and selling it independently in Panama. A risky move, a fatal one. Within a week, their warehouse burned to the ground. Not just flames, precision. 2 guards shot through the left eye, 1 through the throat. No calling cards, no warnings, just surgical silence. Pablo didn't need to send messages. He was the message. From that moment, the whispering stopped. People stopped speculating about who ran things. They knew. In Envigado, the old women began referring to him differently. Not just Pablito now. They called him El Señor. The streets where he grew up now seemed to bend slightly when he passed, as if they recognized him. He wasn't just a boy with ambition anymore. He was becoming a fixture. Something between myth and memory. Still, he gave back. That was key. He didn't just hand out money. He built clinics, bought uniforms for kids, fixed roofs before the rainy season, helped parents bury children when tragedy hit. He remembered names, sent flowers, offered silence instead of speeches. People said he had 2 hearts, one cold and calculating, the other warm and generous. And maybe that was true, but both hearts beat for one thing: control. Gustavo sometimes questioned him, not openly, but in side comments. "You're building an empire," he said once, staring at a stack of cash that had been damaged by mold. "No," Pablo replied. "I'm building history." And maybe that was it. Maybe for him, it was never just about money. It was about permanence. He wanted to matter. And in a country that forgot people as quickly as it buried them, that desire burned hotter than the sun. He dabbled in politics again, quietly, under the radar, met with local leaders, smiled at church picnics, donated to public schools, always with clean bills and cleaner intentions. Or so it looked. One day, he told Gustavo, "You can't just rule from shadows forever. One day you have to step into the light." Gustavo just nodded. He knew what came with light: exposure. And exposure attracted bullets. Still, the plan grew. They began working with a group of pilots from Brazil, men with Air Force training and civilian covers. One in particular stood out, a tall man with a scar over his eye and a reputation for never missing a landing. Pablo gave him a call sign: Águila, the Eagle. Águila flew solo missions across the Caribbean, touching down on runways that didn't exist on maps. He became a legend in whispered conversations. Some said he flew blind, others said he flew drunk, but he always flew true. Each successful trip built Pablo's reputation higher, but reputation is a double-edged thing. It draws friends and enemies alike. A young colonel in Bogota began asking questions, a bit too loudly. Started connecting dots, writing memos, speaking at conferences. He died in a car. Accident. Brakes failed. Tree didn't. His wife received flowers the next day. No card, just roses. The thorns had been clipped. That's how it worked. Silence was currency. Obedience bought life. By the early 80s, Pablo controlled a significant portion of cocaine moving into the United States. But it wasn't just America now. Spain, Italy, even parts of Asia. The dust moved like wind. The profits grew so large they had to store money in barns, literally, hidden behind fake walls, under floors, inside haystacks. Rats chewed through it. Moisture rotted it. But there was always more. One accountant once asked if they should start investing in banks. real estate, offshore accounts. Pablo just smiled. Money is only useful if it makes people obey. Real estate doesn't kill traitors. But even he knew things were shifting. The Americans were starting to pay attention. The DEA, customs, men with suits and smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They weren't loud about it. Not yet. But he felt the tension, the storm behind the horizon. So he prepared. He upgraded his communication systems, installed hidden radios, coded signals, escape routes, trained his people in counter-surveillance, moved meetings to random locations, sometimes in a moving car, sometimes on a fishing boat, sometimes at a funeral. He began trusting fewer people, watched their eyes when they spoke, counted the seconds between questions and answers. Loyalty was now a daily test. His wife noticed. She'd ask him if he slept. He said yes, but he didn't. Not really. He'd lie in bed and think about maps, routes, betrayals that hadn't happened yet. He'd picture faces, some smiling, some not. All possible threats. One night he sat in the courtyard, watching lightning far in the distance. Gustavo sat beside him. "You ever think it'll all end?" Gustavo asked. Pablo didn't blink. "Everything ends, but I'll choose when." He believed that, at least for now. And so the labs kept burning, the planes kept flying, the bribes kept flowing. Cities changed, people vanished, the numbers got bigger. But Pablo, he stayed the same, at least on the surface. Inside, something else was waking up. Not ambition, not greed, something colder. The kind of thing that didn't dream anymore, only calculated. The house was quiet, too quiet for a man with so much noise circling his name. The dogs outside heard everything. Footsteps, whispers, engines in the distance. Pablo had them trained better than most of his men. They barked at lies before they barked at strangers. Inside, he sat alone at the kitchen table, a thick manila folder open in front of him. Satellite images, aerial surveys, redacted memos, all smuggled from Bogota by a military officer whose loyalty had been purchased for less than the cost of a single kilo. He didn't like what he saw. The Americans weren't just watching anymore. They were mapping, recording, building a case with the slow confidence of people who thought time was on their side. Agents were being deployed to embassies. Informants were being planted in shipping companies. Intercepted communications were showing up in classified briefings. Pablo closed the folder and stared at the wall for a long moment. They weren't going to leave him alone. Not anymore. Miami, 1981. The city pulsed like a living creature, its veins pumping with luxury and tension. Boats with too much horsepower drifted through the bay. Clubs filled up before sunset. Every third person on the street wore sunglasses after dark. The city had become a playground for those who didn't need sleep or consequences. And woven through it all, invisible but ever present, was his product. It touched everything. Nightclubs, hospitals, colleges, banks, government offices. It was the powder in the corners of luxury bathrooms, the ghost behind every $100 bill. But Pablo stayed out of Miami. That was rule number one, never touch the fire directly. He had men for that, and those men had men beneath them. Distributors, enforcers, cleaners. Everyone had a role, a script to follow. If anyone ad-libbed, they were erased. Still, Miami was becoming a problem. Two of his top earners had started growing too fast, buying islands, flying helicopters just to go grocery shopping. One even bought a tiger. Not a metaphor, a real, living tiger, chained up on his mansion lawn like a security system. Foolishness. And worse, they were talking too much. To journalists, to lawyers, to women with big earrings and bigger mouths. So Pablo sent a message, not with a bullet, with silence. The next shipment bypassed both men, went to a third party instead, someone quiet, small time, grateful. The message landed harder than any execution. One of them got the point and vanished into the Caribbean with a fake name. The other kept pushing. He died in a home invasion that didn't look like a home invasion. Even the cops knew better than to investigate. Back in Colombia, Pablo stood on the roof of his newest compound. It was half fortress, half estate, an architectural contradiction of high walls, manicured gardens, and steel-reinforced bunkers. Beneath the tennis court was a tunnel that could get him out in under 5 minutes. The ceiling fans in his bedroom concealed weapons. Every window could be sealed shut in 10 seconds. Gustavo walked up beside him. "You're spending more on defenses than we are on routes." Pablo didn't answer immediately. He was watching a hawk circle overhead. "When the wolves gather," he said, "you don't wait to hear them howl." He turned away and walked inside. The network was massive now, too massive to manage like before, so he built a tiered structure, cells within cells, like a criminal beehive. Each unit knew only what it needed to. No one saw the whole picture except him and Gustavo. Their reach extended into nearly every institution: customs agents, local judges, mayors, military officers, one presidential candidate, though Pablo would never confirm it out loud. He called it the invisible state. Not just a cartel, a system. People didn't understand that. They thought he sold drugs. He didn't. He sold access. He sold influence. The cocaine was just a means. The real product was power. The political play. It started slowly. A public donation here, a new playground there, press photos with orphans, smiling priests, clean water initiatives, food drives, television interviews. People loved him. Not because they didn't know what he did, but because they did. He was one of them. Not a foreign politician. Not a distant millionaire. He walked the same streets they did, ate the same food, buried the same kind of dead. When he announced his run for Congress, the crowds roared. He ran as an alternate, a substitute, an afterthought, technically. But the numbers came back stronger than expected. He won a seat, not just because of the votes, but because no one dared to not count them. In the halls of power, Pablo wore suits now, expensive ones. Still no tie. He hated the feeling. Around him, the air shifted. He was no longer just El Señor from the barrio. He was now the Honorable Representative Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. And with that title came something new: immunity. The Americans were furious. The Colombian elites were livid. But the poor, they celebrated. Fireworks, feasts. The boy from the hills had entered the palace. Gustavo warned him, "This won't last. They'll come for you." Pablo shrugged. "Then I'll build my own palace." The pushback. The backlash came faster than expected. Journalists began digging. Foreign diplomats applied pressure. Intelligence agencies leaked documents. His past, once ignored or dismissed, was now being presented with laser precision. A plane crash killed one of his political enemies. Coincidence, they said. But whispers began. Eyes watched. Eventually, under overwhelming pressure, he was forced to resign. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He simply walked out of the government building, smiled at the cameras, and said, "They don't want peace. They want obedience." The people rallied behind him even harder. La Catedral, the fortress, disguised as a prison, negotiations began under the table. The government, desperate to reduce violence and foreign scrutiny, made an offer: surrender and serve time in a custom-built facility. No extradition, no trial. Pablo agreed, but only on his terms. The result was La Catedral, a prison in name only. It sat on a hill overlooking the valley with panoramic views and private quarters. There were guards, his guards. There were schedules, which he set. Visitors came freely. Some left with suitcases. Inside, he hosted meetings, resolved disputes, threw parties, executed traitors, all behind the illusion of captivity. The Americans were furious. The press dubbed it Club Medellín. But for Pablo, it was a test. If he could be in prison and still run everything, then what really could stop him? But power, like fire, consumes. Not everyone was happy. Rivals began aligning. The Cali cartel was no longer content playing second fiddle. Smaller outfits formed coalitions bankrolled by his enemies. A new group emerged, Los Pepes, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar. But they weren't just victims. They were hunters, armed, funded, ruthless. They began dismantling his empire piece by piece, burning properties, killing lawyers, targeting family, turning public fear into rage. Pablo struck back. Bombings, assassinations, retaliations that painted the streets red. Colombia became a war zone. The death toll blurred the line between soldier and civilian. The government, pushed to the edge, finally allowed full U.S. cooperation. Elite units trained by foreign agents began tracking him, and still, he fought, like a lion in a burning forest. La Catedral collapses. In 1992, under mounting pressure, the government attempted to transfer him to a real prison. He vanished. No firefight, no bloodshed, just gone. Escaped from a prison he built himself. The manhunt that followed was unlike anything the country had ever seen. Helicopters, satellite phones, intercepted calls, family homes raided, safe houses leveled. Pablo moved constantly, never stayed in one place more than 3 nights. Slept in barns, crawl spaces, jungle bunkers, ate cold food, shaved his beard, changed his voice. But he was alone now. Gustavo was dead, killed in a shootout. Other lieutenants had flipped or fled. The money still flowed, but slower. Loyalty drained away under pressure, and he aged. Not in body, in soul. The fire inside dimmed. The hunter had become the hunted. A final call, December 2nd, 1993. A small apartment in Medellín. Pablo used a borrowed phone to call his son. He kept it short, warm, almost peaceful, but the call was traced. Minutes later, the building was surrounded. Gunfire erupted. He ran to the roof, firing back. A bullet struck him behind the ear. Some say it was a soldier. Others say he did it himself. Either way, he fell. Face down, on a rooftop in the city he once ruled. And yet, ask anyone in the barrio. Ask the old women sweeping their steps, the kids playing soccer with duct-taped balls. They'll tell you he never really died. They'll point to the schools, the clinics, the walls he built. They'll say, El Patron still watches. And maybe, in some way, he does. Not as a man, but as a ghost. A legend carved into the spine of a nation that learned to love its monsters because no one else ever protected it. The gunfire had stopped. Smoke rose over the rooftops of Medellín, mingling with the scent of cordite and concrete dust. In the street below, a crowd had already begun to form. Neighbors, children, reporters, soldiers, all staring up at the broken body of a man who had once ruled the city like a king behind walls of smoke and silver. December 2nd, 1993. Pablo Escobar was dead, but his story was far from over. They buried him quickly, not out of disrespect but necessity. The government feared his funeral would become a battleground. Too many enemies, too many loyalists. They tried to keep it quiet, private. It didn't work. Thousands came. Not just friends or family, but the poor, the forgotten, the desperate. People who remembered free medicine and food baskets. Who remembered playgrounds rising in neighborhoods long abandoned by the state. A woman, maybe 70, laid flowers and whispered through her tears. He was the only one who ever gave us something. To them, Pablo wasn't a villain. He was a flawed saint, a fallen Robin Hood, a man who sinned in service of the broken. They didn't ignore the bombs or the blood. They simply weighed it differently. Back in the shadows, men scrambled. With Pablo gone, the Medellín cartel shattered into splinters. His lieutenants had either been killed, captured, or were in hiding. His safe houses were compromised. His cash, hidden in fields and walls and tunnels, was being looted by police, by rivals, by his own people. What was once a machine became a carcass. Cali moved quickly. The rival cartel had played a long game, quieter, more corporate, more surgical. Where Pablo had ruled with fear, Cali moved with corruption, lawyers, accountants, bribes instead of bombs. In less than 6 months, they absorbed key routes, bought disloyal Medellín remnants, and silenced opposition. The war was over, but the business continued. While the public danced around the idea of justice, another truth emerged. Pablo Escobar wasn't brought down solely by Colombian police or DEA surveillance. He was hunted by Los Pepes, a vigilante group composed of victims, rivals, and ex-cartel men. But what made them deadly wasn't just vengeance. It was protection. Sources later revealed that Los Pepes were supported indirectly by state forces. Information leaked from intelligence units, arrests conveniently avoided. Certain raids never happened. In exchange, Los Pepes cleaned the streets, their way. Ruthlessly, bloodily, without trials. Law and outlaw had merged. Colombia had made a deal with the devil to kill a greater one. And the people? They cheered. The boy who inherited a ghost. Juan Pablo Escobar was 16 when his father died. He didn't cry. Not then. Not when they fled. Not when the bullets stopped flying. But he never forgot. The world turned on him instantly. His family's homes were seized. His name became toxic. Banks froze accounts. Governments revoked visas. Countries closed their borders. He, his mother, and sister became nomads, exiled by blood. They ended up in Argentina, under assumed names. A dentist, a teacher, a boy who kept his head down. But no matter where they hid, Pablo's name followed. Books, documentaries, gossip, movies, cartoons, t-shirts. He wasn't just a memory. He was merchandise. Years later, the boy-turned-man would write a letter, not to defend his father, but to humanize him. He spoke to the children of Pablo's victims, apologized, explained, and then he changed his name. Because to carry Escobar was to carry 1,000 funerals. For Colombia, the 1990s became an era of surgery. The state tried to cut out the cancer Pablo left behind. Extraditions were reinstated. The Cali cartel was taken down next, not with glory, but with cold efficiency. Its leaders arrested and placed in real prisons, not hilltop fortresses. A new era of drug trafficking rose, splintered, decentralized. La Oficina, Los Rastrojos, Bacrim, Clan del Golfo. None is visible, none is grand, but all dangerous. Cocaine didn't stop flowing, it just changed hands. The violence shrank in scale but remained insidious. Targeted assassinations instead of citywide bombings. Corruption with less blood. Smarter devils. By the early 2000s, Colombia had rebranded itself. Tourism surged. Medellín won urban planning awards. Tech hubs. Fashion. Art. But in the hills, people still whispered, Pablo built that road. Pablo funded that clinic. Pablo buried something in that forest. The global obsession begins in death. Pablo became immortal. Hollywood couldn't resist. Writers turned his life into legend. Netflix dramatized it. Musicians referenced him. Streetwear brands printed his mugshot on hoodies. To the world, he was a symbol of rebellion, of excess, of power unchecked. To young men in rough neighborhoods, he became an idol. El Patron, the man who made the world bend. But it was always a lie. They didn't show the fear, the paranoia, the mistrust, the endless nights of silence and betrayal. They didn't show how he died, alone, hunted, his empire collapsing around him. Myths are never accurate. They're just louder than truth. The legacy he never wanted in Medellín, the old zoo he built at Hacienda Nápoles, fell into disrepair. Hippos, once smuggled in as a joke, multiplied. Their descendants now roam rivers far from their African home. Locals call them cocaine hippos. It's absurd, and yet oddly perfect. A symbol of everything Pablo left behind. Wild, invasive, unintended. Like the hippos, his influence lingers in places it shouldn't. In the end, what was he? A boy from Rio Negro. A thief, a smuggler, a husband who kissed his wife before placing a bomb, a father who burned stacks of money to keep his daughter warm in hiding, a congressman, a fugitive. A saint to some, a terrorist to others. He was all of it, and none of it. The man Pablo Escobar died in 1993, but the idea of him, the myth, was just getting started. Postscript: the country. He changed Colombia, 3 decades later, still speaks his name. Not always in anger, not always in reverence, but always with weight. Because what Pablo Escobar really did wasn't just build an empire. He exposed a system. He showed the world that if a government fails its people long enough, someone, anyone, can rise to fill that void. Even a criminal, even a monster. Especially a monster. Epilogue. Ghosts in the walls. There's a barrio in Medellín where an old mural still fades on a sun-bleached wall. It shows Pablo smiling, arms outstretched, children around him. Someone has spray-painted over it in black. No más ídolos de sangre. No more idols of blood. And maybe that's the final truth, not the myth, not the headlines, not the series or the interviews. Just a country learning slowly to move past the ghosts, but never forgetting the lessons they carved. Decades slid by, but the shadow of his empire remained in every whisper of the wind through Medellín's steep alleyways. Children chased soccer balls in streets his money paved. Clinics stood on land, his construction crews flattened. The scent of gasoline and powder may have faded, but his ripple never did. After his fall, new wheels began to spin. Small rings emboldened former soldiers, splintered groups. They learned from his playbook. They didn't seek headlines, just territory. Control worked differently now. Less show, more system. Cartels fragmented. They traded spectacular bombs for discreet subversion. It was quieter, but the poison spread deeper. In the hills beyond the city, old safe houses decayed, hidden beneath vines. Smugglers sifted through collapsed walls, looking for hidden caches, papers, pills, cash. Crews long disbanded returned to loot the ghosts. Animal bones, rotting bills, expired passports. Everything told a story. Everything pointed back to him. The grandchildren of neighborhoods he once helped grew old, watching politicians grow rich with silence. They learned early. Loyalty wasn't given. It was currency. They wore tattoos of eagles and pistols, but no longer his name. Their idols were new, sharper. This was Cartel 2.0. Networked, global, algorithmic violence. They used encrypted apps, cryptocurrency offshoots, hidden planes. They preferred overhead drones and dark web capital instead of beachfront mansions. International pressure reshaped the rules. Cartels began laundering through Goldman Sachs-style fronts, offshore casinos, cryptocurrency miners. No more bulky cash barns. Now money talked in code. The faces changed. The methods evolved. But the DNA traced back to him. Ambition, calculation, willingness to bleed neighborhoods to feed fields. Despite all this, Colombia changed too. Medellín, once a bullet-riddled fortress, transformed into a hub of innovation. Tech incubators sprouted beside former gun racks. Urban farms rose where pill factories once puffed fumes. Street artists painted Reyes. Poets recited truth to power. Global tourists wandered carefully down sanitized hills once guarded by stone walls. In living rooms, grandparents recounted stories of El Patron, not with idealism, but weary reverence. They spoke of him like a force of nature, a hurricane, something that could not be stopped. Not because of strength, but because something inside the country had corroded first. The hippos in Hacienda Nápoles numbered dozens now, swimming in slow rivers, calves at their sides. They ignored fences. They multiplied. Tourists fed them lettuce. Locals whispered, "Escaped empire." Biology made myths physical. The animals outlived power. One teacher came forward years later, opening a school near his old estate. She taught kids math with stories of figures and risk. She said Pablo turned numbers into terror, but also into hope. It didn't matter how you remembered him, she told her students. What mattered was how you learned from him. His son, years later, visited Colombia under a new name. He walked the streets cautiously. He donated to scholarship funds, wrote long letters in newspapers apologizing to families. He tried to rebuild trust brick by brick. But trust is fragile. And when your father was myth and monster both, forgiveness becomes a maze. The government erected memorials, victims of drug violence, families torn apart, police officers lost in black ops. They tried to fix history, but walls only hold so much. Ghosts slip through cracks, rewriting the past in corners where light can't reach. In the world's media landscape, series and movies continued to exploit the imagery. Every decade brought a new dramatization: the humble boy who creeps into power, the lavish villa, the bloody finale. The narrative folded into aesthetics: leather jackets, cigars, hippos on lawn. Pop culture sold glamour. But real mothers chanted prayers, not applause. The next generation of cartels drew lessons, used dislike from the state to craft legitimacy with locals, flood neighborhoods with money, then flip to charity. Justifications came packaged in aid: build clinics, sponsor ball games, buy silence with infrastructure, build poverty as your stage. But globalization also changed the game. Cuban pilots flew faster, Mexican traffickers moved more product through new routes, new synthetic drugs emerged: fentanyl, meth, designer opioids. Cocaine shrank in market share. The violence shifted. The casualties looked different: younger, more distant, more numerous. He once said his empire was built on silence. Now violence is louder, but silent too. Overdoses in U.S. suburbs, digital extortion in African ports, corrupt officials in Southeast Asian labs. His model mutated, found new soil, yet none of these successors touched his legend. Not entirely. He remained the standard, the original ghost. Aspiring traffickers studied maps of routes he built decades ago, renovated old airstrips into GPS coordinates. They bought ruins of estate lands, claimed proximity as pedigree. They tattooed hippo skulls. They called themselves heirs. And Colombia, still reckoning, built museums, exhibits showing ledgers, planes, guns, lab glassware. They invited former policemen, survivors, families. But visitors lingered longest before a display of his childhood bicycle, rusted, small enough to fit a boy's legs. The plaque read, "Here began a ledger's dream." In neighborhoods, the new Medellins, they raised stories differently, not glorifying, but forensic. Documentaries interviewing old maids, park sweepers, school teachers. They shared small kindnesses and darker secrets. They insisted he wasn't legend. He was a man making choices. But legends endure where history fails. A journalist once asked, years after, about the turning point moment. The shipment intercepted, the first lab built, the first damn airplane. No witness knew exactly. They all said, he was more than an operation. He was calculation. He was patience. He watched. And they paused. Because how do you timestamp silence? The corridors of power across continents still mentioned Colombia in drug reports. The same counties, same charts, new villains. But the echo of his empire-shaped policies, militaries, foreign interventions, money laundering laws, extradition treaties, airport surveillance. He had become a geopolitical variable. Children in American suburbs knew his name, not because they understood him, but because he represented a failure, a crisis, a symbol of consequences. And Colombia? Over time, the world began to say his country could be more than his shadow. Startups, culture, coffee tourists, soccer stars, medical missions. Medellin's brutal mountains gave way to launch pads. Still, whenever rain falls heavy over Callejon Montoya or over hills shrouded in fog, old-timers glance upward. They don't fear. They remember. They remember that a boy on a bicycle built something unstoppable, until history built something bigger. Time passed, but the echoes lingered. Governments shifted, policies changed. Yet the specter of his empire kept governments awake in distant chambers, drafting treaties, training agents, and closing loopholes. In Bogota and Washington, talks framed around extradition and asset seizures became common currency, often referencing his name as the cautionary example. International law shifted in his image. Meanwhile, in Medellin's neighborhoods, the air grew thicker with possibility. The city's valleys filled with entrepreneurs again. Cafes, artisanal workshops, tech startups. Walls once tagged with bullet holes now showcased street murals demanding peace, equality, and memory. Guides took tourists along old crime routes but pointed not to glamour, to warning. Children told stories not about his riches, but about the mothers he left behind. Education became a battlefield of meaning. Schools taught not only math and geography, but also history as truth-telling. The ledgers he once scribbled as a boy became artifacts in glass cases. Students looked at them, tracing the lines to understand how numbers could turn into violence. Teachers asked, how does ambition turn contagious? How do societies let monsters build themselves? Their voices echoed through classrooms. Communities rebuilt. Where airstrips once lay, now stood soccer pitches, hydroponic farms, solar panels. International NGOs planted trees, taught sustainable entrepreneurship, offered microloans, sometimes to former smugglers who'd laid down guns. The new equation, redemption through rebuilding. Drugs still flowed, yes, but profit alone no longer seemed invincible. He had changed something too fundamental. The term narco-state entered global lexicon. Media began saying his story showed how criminal networks could mirror governments, create alternate systems of justice, economy, surveillance, loyalty. Smart agents around the globe studied his model, not because they admired it, but because they had to understand it. Pablo wasn't just criminal. He was case study. Writers kept telling his tale. Some romanticized, others condemned. But many aimed to dissect the man behind myth. The clandestine plains and jungles, the hollow promises, the feasting beside funerals. They wanted to show that what he sold wasn't just cocaine, it was illusion. Bolivar thought leaders debated the roots of his rise in university lecture halls. Poverty, corruption, inequality, lack of opportunity, weak institutions. These were the soil. He was just the weed that thrived. Some historians argued he revealed the state's failures. Others said he exploited them. Either way, his passage forced reckoning. Drug policy followed him. Precursors were controlled tighter. Border patrols expanded. Intelligence sharing between nations increased. Some countries sought decriminalization of small quantities. Others built harsher walls. Yet every measure found ways to morph. New drugs, cryptocurrencies, darknet marketplaces, all multiplied in the gaps. For his former henchmen, many found prisons after long manhunts. Some died in shootouts. Others disappeared quietly. A few turned informants, testifying in witness protection, their voices broken. They spoke of loyalty built on drugs and violence. But in the stern decor of courts, their words felt hollow. Scripts forced by survival. In rural towns his crew had touched, elders described how life once revolved around payments. School books bought with cash, medicine delivered by those same trucks. Then came crackdowns, clinics closed, children watched fathers taken away. Suddenly, silence vanished, and with it, the forced order his money bought. Years later, when famine hit parts of Antioquia because of landslides, locals whispered, if El Patron were alive, this wouldn't happen. Not because they missed his violence, but because they equated money with stability. They missed certainty, even if it came in terrifying packaging. At international conferences, survivors told stories. Journalists threatened. Minor-level cops bribed. Farmers who secretly saw men landing planes in nearby clearings. Their testimonies built a mosaic of fear and presence. Still, most official narratives named the system, not the man. His tactics studied yet passed over as history. Meanwhile, descendants of his clinics and parks passed donation stations. A plaque somewhere read, built with funds we cannot name, for people we must remember. It was an uneasy truth. Forgetting means repeating. Remembering means building. New cartels adapted his blueprint, but sought distance. They offered community sponsorships, clean delivery apps, technical training, soccer leagues, artisanal schools. They whispered, "See, we're different." But beneath the surface, they traded alliances and violence all the same. Money still spoke. Colombian music honored him indirectly. Cumbia and reggaeton lied inside lyrics. From nothing to kingdom. Born in the streets, buried by history. Not celebration, but mythos. The hippo became symbol. His unexpected herd roaming Colombian waters became mascot of unpredictability, of nature infiltrating control. One eccentric art collective organized hippo-watching tours. Young activists handed out leaflets. These animals are his legacy too, strange, invasive, powerful. But wildness doesn't equate to harmony. Tourists took selfies, while guides told the cautionary tale. In black markets globally, code names referencing birds or rivers traced back to his root names. Cartels copied his cell structure, loyalty sliced thin, redundancy thick as concrete. International narcotics officers spotted the blueprint in Myanmar, in West Africa, in New Zealand's growing organic lab network slipping cocaine precursors. He had seeded not just destruction, but methodology. Yet Colombia persevered. Medellín climbed to host global anti-corruption conferences, climate summits, innovation challenge hubs. The same hills that once echoed gunfire now hosted drones that monitored deforestation, clean buses, light rail, rising skyscrapers. The skyline changed faster than memory faded. Still, memory stayed alive in subtle ways. Families raised children with warnings. Don't idolize wealth built on death. Tell stories of kindness twisted into terror. Keep the history rigorous, not romantic. In the end, what appears unstoppable still bends. Institutions strengthened. Civil society rose. Journalism flourished. Reporters exposed laundromats, shell corporations, ghost airplanes. Victims forced policymakers to act. Cartels splintered. Drug profits shrank in some markets. Still, the war morphed, not ended. Pablo's myth remained the boundary line. The formula, charisma plus community plus terror equals control, but now recognized as blueprint for ruin, not redemption. At night in Medellín, wind whispers stories to rooftops. The hills remember footsteps on dirt roads. Some planes still land in secret fields. Some cameras still follow discreet pilots. But most of the time, heat finds peace in the city. Children grow up now building apps, gardens, cafes, not fighting or smuggling. They ride bicycles through parks his cash once built. They know his name, but treat it cautiously. They want history to be lens, not legend. The empire he built died, but the lesson he left endures. That emptiness invites monsters. That power answers silence but demands sacrifice. And that real peace is built on justice, not boxes of money or corridors of fear. In the quiet corners of schools, classrooms, churches, citizens keep telling different stories now. Stories of hope, stories of accountability, stories that remind the world, even giants fall. And when they do, what rises matters more. Trails of smoke and stories weave through Medellín's valleys long after that empire collapsed. Old safe houses are now homes, studios, or art galleries. Tourists tread cautiously where once footsteps meant danger. It's quiet mostly, until memory speaks. Generations still remember him. They tell each other, he was bigger than the state. They speak in past tense, but with present weight. Children learn about narcos as history, but also as warning. Teachers open lessons asking, what does it take for one man on a bicycle to nearly collapse a country? That question rattles minds. Colombia changed. The state rebuilt. Anti-narcotic units trained with foreign agents. Courts finally prosecuted lower-level operatives, laundering networks, financiers. Cartel remnants were labeled BACRIM or Clan del Golfo. They moved more quietly, less visibly, But they still reached out across borders, still moved product. Some succeeded at mixing violence with invisibility better than Pablo ever could. Globally, digital fronts sprouted. Shipments moved hidden in shipping containers and drones. Cryptocurrencies replaced stacks of cash. The corridors of influence, embassies, shell companies, front corporations, grew more labyrinthine. Smart traffickers studied old blueprints, kept cell structures, used encrypted protocols. They didn't need villas, they needed servers. Still, the blueprint came from him. Layered loyalty, divisions of labor, community goodwill tied to fear. But now law enforcement adapted. They hacked drones, traced crypto wallets, infiltrated messaging apps. They followed patterns his empire left. Often the same paths that once carried product still carried surveillance drones. Civil society rose. Medellin's residents created forums, NGOs, international partnerships. They rebuilt communities Oscar Perez once destroyed. Art collectives painted murals of victims, not of hero narcos. Youth programs offered alternatives: coding, entrepreneurship, sustainable agriculture. Former smugglers became educators. One man who once flew small cargo planes now taught drone repair. He apologized. He shared calculus of loss. He taught that maps can shape destiny or destroy it. International dialogue changed too. The phrase narco-state used often. Countries studying Colombia's model now saw the danger. Money can corrupt institutions faster than bullets break bodies. Foreign aid programs focused on strengthening local justice systems, not just militarized interdiction. Meanwhile, the hippos remained. They proliferated, greedy and oblivious, in rivers and lakes. Tourists fed them lettuce. Guides whispered the origins. Runaway empire turning wild. Scientists studied them. They saw ecological imbalance, invasive species. Yet locals joke. They are living history. You could almost say they swallow memory with every ripple. In the modern cartels, the rhetoric shifted. They offered development packages, community funds, soccer leagues, water wells, always with strings, demands of silence, loyalty, exchange. People accepted because the state still shrank in reach. Weak public services left gaps that criminals filled. Poverty and inequality remained fertile ground for new narcos. They looked at Pablo's give and take. Give resources, demand allegiance, repeat cycle. That model migrated. In West Africa, Southeast Asia, Central America, young operators studied how Medellín operated. They built syndicates using the same logic. Violence concealed by charity, power masked by delivery. They moved labs into jungle clearings, ports, rural airstrips. They kept silent pilots flying small planes, laden with chemicals or finished product. They created cell-based redundancy. They tested loyalty constantly. Law enforcement studied too. They watched patterns, where he smuggled, who was loyal, who was expendable. They created profiles. They began mapping modern networks. Social scientists questioned, was Escobar innovation or corruption of a broken structure? The answers shaped policy. Young Colombians now graduate from universities and NGOs to work in conflict transformation. They hold forums where ex-military and ex-narco operatives testify, forensic style. They reconcile. They plant olive trees. They fund micro-businesses. They support journalism that tracks money, not myth. Cartels adapted with technology. Drones hover over fields. Encrypted apps deliver instructions. Crypto laundering makes tracking harder. But the human patterns remain. Greed, ambition, calculation. Networks fracture. New leaders emerge. Violence remains. But justice improves. In Medellin's rebuilt plazas, murals echo. Nunca más. A promise. Never again. Young entrepreneurs launch apps and shops near boarded-up villas. They work for brands, not bombs. They curate tours of history. Elastic lines painted on the ground show where bombs fell. They don't glamorize. They contextualize. In international legal chambers, extraditions reference his case as precedent. Money laundering laws echo the precise loopholes he exploited. Judges craft rulings citing his legacy. He becomes a touchstone for jurisprudence. In South Florida, Miami police crack cocaine networks that mirror his old flow. They monitor strip clubs, shipping yards, financial transactions. They recognize names. One agent says, "We're still watching the veins he created decades ago." Victims of narco violence formed coalition groups. Families of journalists killed, communities destroyed, police assassinated. They fight impunity. They press the state to restore land, rebuild schools. They become watchdogs. They lobby Congress for transparency and foreign aid. They cry for reparations. In conferences, survivors from Mexico, Guatemala, Brazil compare histories. They show how the Medellín blueprint became regional template. They forge alliances, share prosecutorial strategies, intelligence techniques. Pop culture still recycles. New shows dramatize his rise. Hip-hop lyrics reference cigarettes, jungle labs, kingpins. The hippo motif remains evergreen. But activists counter with t-shirts saying, "Not idol, not model, memory, not myth." At night in Medellín's lights and towers and slums, you can see both sides of that legacy. New condos and new graffiti, street startups and street hawkers, light rails and poverty-lined gutters, economic growth and a half-healed society. People talk about him not like a king anymore, but like a warning. He had a dream, they say. He built roads, but he also built a battleground. Equilibrium hangs in balance. Institutions strengthened but fragile. Memory preserved, yes, but contested. The story of that boy who turned pencil into ledger, ledger into empire, empire into legend continues. But not with its own power, with parentheses, with lessons, with caution. Colombia learned that true power isn't built on fear or cash. Real power thrives on rule of law, opportunity, education. That silence can be bought, but peace must be grown. In neighborhoods under the fog, children draw new mural lines. They draw futures, not footnotes. They see paths illuminated not by money or myth, but by justice and choice. And so the empire finally ends. Not with bombs, but with memory worn as armor. A country rebuilt, refusing to vanish into myth. When you walk through Medellín today, some mornings feel as soft as forgiveness. The air is quiet, fresh from pipe-cleaned rain. But listen close. Underneath that calm is the echo of old corridors and secret flights. You might pass a cafe built in a renovated hacienda, logs carved from bones of a past empire, and not know it. That's the thing about memory. It hides in plain sight. People live in what used to be safe houses, run businesses in what used to be fields of contraband chemistry. Places that shipped powder under moonlight now serve espresso and host open mic nights. Conversation hums with reclaimed energy, but the ghosts still whisper in tiled walls and cracked paint. There are families who've stayed, and families who fled. Some mothers still carry grief, others hold anger. But the city built branches in both directions. The children ride bicycles on streets he once terrorized. They see surveillance cameras where planes used to land. They don't think of Pablo as myth. They think of him as a chapter in a textbook with underlines, questions, and margins to annotate. Cartels today are different. They follow the same patterns but hide behind apps, hackers, satellite phones. They move product through remote ports, sympathetic officials, even vampire funds, cryptocurrency that bleeds liquidity but leaves no fingerprints. But enforcement adapted too. Drones patrol ranches. Cyber analysts track transfers. Border agents use facial recognition. They plug holes that used to breed fugitives. We still use his name as code. Legal filings reference Escobar tactics. Intelligence memos say, following the Medellín blueprint. Journalists teach, anyone researching narco-justice or narco-philanthropy must learn how he blurred lines. It's not praise, it's caution. Then there's the hippos, the wild, sprawling hippo population that now roams ponds and rivers near Hacienda Nápoles. Biologists say they're ecological nightmares. Carnivorous fish die-offs, invasive grass spread drowning native biodiversity. Tourists take boat rides to see them, snapping photos of a weird monument to recklessness and unintended consequence. Locals joke, that's his legacy. Some community leaders decided to give the hippos their own meaning. Eco-tours turned into lessons, how money turned into animals, how power turns wild when unchecked. Schools bring kids to feed lettuce but teach them about unintended immigration, how humans, like animals, spread when money plants seeds in strange ground. No idols, just warnings. Memory projects emerged. A former safe house became a freedom museum. Children enter through winding corridors labeled Paths of Fear and exit into gardens labeled Corridors of Hope. Exhibits show shipping ledgers, burned boots, photographs of broken families. They teach cycles, not glamour. Looted money in glass cases sits beside tally books and broken bullet casings. On walls is painted, "We remember so we don't repeat." Survivors collect testimonies. Farmers whose lands were turned into airstrips speak on video, sometimes trembling, sometimes resolute. One elderly woman still points to a scar on her arm where an errant bullet struck. She says, "He called us poor, but he made us collateral." Her voice echoes through halls of memory projects. It's not myth, it's testimony. Colombian kids grow up now with mentors who survived the narco wars. Ex-lawyers, teachers, police officers, they tell their stories. A teacher named Camila asks her students to draw maps of Medellín from before and after. One young boy draws graffiti on the old airport runway. "That's where planes used to land," he says, then draws a playground where the runway was. That's our future. Cartels still rise. Violence resurfaces when governments falter. Farmers grow coca again when subsidies vanish. Children join armed groups when schools close. So the lessons stay relevant. But enforcement and society learned from him, not to romanticize, but to respond. That half the battle is speech. How you talk about him is how you choose the future. International agencies train new generations of detectives in Bogota, Lima, Mexico City. They bring DVDs of documentary footage. They teach case studies, how he recruited, how he built cult, how he lost it all. They emphasize community resilience, anti-corruption, financial tracking. They call it Escobar as syllabus, not criminal admiration, but curriculum. Meanwhile, in Medellín's renovated plazas, youth festivals celebrate coding, arts, entrepreneurship. They invite survivors to speak. They paint murals with broken chains. They innovate agro-tech startups, where labs once incubated cocaine. They queue at stands that sell coffee brewed from beans grown on lands once cleared for airstrips. A youth group called Semilla de Paz, Seed of Peace, organizes hippo cleanup days. They pick up plastic, rope, feed tablets, and teach about ecology and ethics. They document hippo tracks and talk about legacy. One teenager says, "They're big, they're ours, but they're wild. We feed them lettuce, but we plant sanity." That's the irony. They cradle monster echoes while nurturing accountability. Cartels in Mexico, Central America, Asia study his playbook. They learn, build infrastructure in poor areas, sponsor clinics, offer employment, build sports leagues, create allegiance before violence. But enforcement recips advise, build data infrastructure too, build national integrity commissions, support journalism, empower communities. They write policies referencing Medellín's theorem, humanitarian bandit meets structural void. The remedy, institution before individual. Pop culture still churns his image. T-shirts, murals, memes. But critics push back, not tribute. Many Colombian artists produce counter-images. Broken crown, empty throne. They say, if history is a mirror, don't glamorize the cracks. Make them tools. Families still grieve. Mothers of victims form alliances across borders. Honduras, Guatemala, Brazil. They meet via Zoom, share stories of journalists lost, Police killed, neighborhoods erased. They write letters to governments demanding reparations and land restoration. They carry petitions to UN offices. They call it resistance through memory. And Medellín, it ambles on. Clean buses glide beside murals. Startups hum. Libraries expand. But tourists still ask, where did Pablo live? Someone points, then asks, can I take a photo? The guide says, yes, just stand, but look at the other houses too. Meaning, don't freeze on his story. See the whole neighborhood. Sometimes night silent, someone sees a flicker of light in hills where contraband labs once hid. Farmers say, some places never forget, so they leave candles at crossroads. Others leave flowers at graffiti memorials. Young couples carve initials in memory walls. They don't love the man. They love what became of survival. Cartels will rise again. Nature's ants rebuild tunnels, drown concrete, find new routes. The same patterns persist. But society learned to respond with solidity. Institutions, memory, education, community. Not violence, not forgetfulness. The story of that boy on a bicycle continued, but not in legend. It continues in school books, memorial gardens, hippo-watched rivers, policemen trained, youth choosing startups over guns. His empire died, but the lesson thrives. So, when mist fills Medellín's hills in morning light, the city breathes clean air and cautious peace. It knows that forgetfulness births monsters. So it remembers. So monsters cannot rise again. The land changed, but history whispered through every ripple in the Magdalena Basin. Today, hippos roam where labs once pumped fumes. Scientists began counting them, 91 by 2022, growing almost 10% a year. YouTube Nature. Projections warned of 230 by 2032 and over 1,000 by mid-century. The cost to control them would run into millions. Wait a decade and costs balloon nature. One male sterilization costs $50,000 and leaves scars. For hippos and people alike. Local communities face peril. Fishermen attacked. Cattle drives disrupted. Rivers changing tone under giant beasts. Authorities tried vaccines, castration, relocation, but legal battles ensnared each intervention. In 2024, courts ruled hippos must be eradicated or relocated, sparking outrage and fear. Deutsche Welle. Some suggested shipping 70 to Mexico or India, but no consensus emerged. Meanwhile, cocaine routes evolved. Colombia still produces the bulk. In 2023, annual output neared 3,000 tons, nearly 8 times 2012 levels. Semi-submersible boats, narco subs, carry massive loads unseen, connecting Colombia to the US, Europe, even Asia. One recent interception revealed Colombia's Navy seized its first autonomous narco sub with live surveillance gear, hinting at robotized smuggling powered by Gulf Clan innovation. Global cartel networks now span continents. Latin American groups partner with Morocco's clans in Antwerp to move cocaine via shipping containers. Albanian mafias embed in Ecuador's ports to funnel product into Europe, laundering funds through hospitality and real estate. The Sinaloa cartel conflict spawned factional war in Culiacan, pushing them to open European labs and routes. Europe now imports more cocaine than the US, pressure forcing analysts to warn narco stars are reinventing routes. In the Sahel, seizures jumped from 13 kilos annual average, 2015-20, to over 2,000 kilos in Mauritius in early 2023, a 11,000% surge. AtlanticCouncil.org. It became a cross-continental corridor used in tandem with Africa's drug trafficking syndicates, all once rooted in Colombia's distribution model. Local traffickers adapted Pablo's blueprint, divide operations into cells, recruit in poor towns, offer charity and security through fear, and demand unwavering loyalty. Clan del Golfo leans into these tactics, tying routes through Antioquia to Mexican and European partners. Authorities track these structures. They label it Medellín-style schemata in intelligence reports. Yet governments globally learn too. Intelligence agencies cross-share. track crypto payments, map darknet markets, monitor maritime drop-offs at UK and US coasts, build joint task forces, leverage facial recognition and vessel tracking. Agents use Escobar tactics as curriculum, how to infiltrate, dismantle, prosecute, and restore institutions. Medellín transformed again. Safe houses became museums, labs turned into co-working cafes. Old airstrips became solar-powered farms or youth fields. Community memory centers in former cartel spaces catalog testimonies of victims, police, farmers marked by violence. Visitors trace maps of drug flights, trace bullet holes in ceilings, stand before rusted bicycles of children lost. Schools taught a moral geometry. Boys who scribble ledgers early can become killers or nation builders, depending on opportunity. They use legible artifacts, the old notebooks, burned boots, hidden cash stashes, to show how choices ripple through generations. Youth groups manage hippo tours as ecology lessons. Let them swim, but teach the risks. One teenager said, "These hippos are wild reminders, like legacy made flesh, out of place and dangerous unless managed." Guides feed lettuce with one hand, distribute leaflets with the other, urging respect for ecosystem and history. Survivor projects extend beyond Colombia. Victim coalitions from Guatemala, Honduras, Brazil meet online. They demand restitution, land return, government transparency. They weave collective shape-shifting resistance, united under memories of journalists slain, families broken, ministers ignored. In Miami, UK, Spain, detectives testify. Traces of Colombian cocaine still follow decades-old Antioquia routes. They haul narco subs, crumbling containers, underground labs still echoing methods that Escobar pioneered. Yet now they track blockchain, follow encrypted texts, intercept narco subs mid-sea, and hunt autonomous drones lurking offshore. TheGuardian.com. In Medellín, pigeons flicker on rebuilt rooftops. Startup founders sip coffee and hacker coders swap VPN tips. Children run along streets named for peace activists, not princes of powder. Murals shout, "Not idle, memory." Artists tuck hippoglyphs into murals, not as tribute, but as caution. Whenever it rains over Callejon Montoya, elders say it whispers, every empire blooms until roots rot. Beneath the fog, memory holds court. Youth draw new lines on old maps, write code, plant gardens, build apps. They say, myth ends when knowledge begins, empire dies, lesson lives, and so the final phrase floats through these hills. The boy built an empire on silence and powder, but the country built future on voice and choice. In Colombia's Magdalena Basin, the hippos, once 4 exotic beasts at Escobar's zoo, now number in the hundreds. Scientists estimate around 169 to 170 individuals roaming riverbanks and ponds near Hacienda Nápoles. Without predators and with lush grasslands, their population grows at nearly 10% per year, pushing projections toward 230 hippos by 2032, over 1,000 by 2035 or 2050, if unaddressed communities are torn. Some fishermen fear aggressive hippos disturbing nets and boat traffic. Cattle graze near hippo tracks. Children play at riverside schools. Local markets buzz. Yet a hippo sighting can send a hush through the crowd nature. Ecosystems strain under daily dung of up to 9 kilos per hippo, causing algae blooms and fish die-offs in fragile waterways. Government plans began taking shape in late 2023. Sterile male sterilization at about 40 hippos per year, transfer of roughly 70 animals to sanctuaries in India, Mexico, even the Philippines, and in extreme cases, euthanasia protocols. Still, logistics stall. Permits, funding, and public outcry collide. Critics say mass culling is cruel. Others say delay means billions in later costs and ecological ruin nature. The Times. Every sterile surgery costs around $9,800 and captures involve helicopters, risky anesthesia, and handling territorial beasts. Researchers warn, delay 10 years and cost jumps 2.5x. Range spreads further into protected regions. Removal becomes nearly impossible nature. Meanwhile, the global cocaine trade surges. Colombia's 2023 coca cultivation exceeded 253,000 hectares, making it the largest producer globally, about 67% of the world's total, with annual output near 2,600 to 3,000 tons, the city paperbogota.com. Advanced varieties and modern labs yield more product per leaf. Narco subs and chemical concealment make enforcement harder. Law enforcement now tracks narco subs, semi-submersible vessels crossing the Caribbean, connecting Colombia to markets in Europe, Asia, and Africa. One Navy seizure revealed the first autonomous narco sub, complete with live surveillance gear, hinting at drone-controlled smuggling innovation, WSJ.com. Global criminal networks adapt Pablo's blueprint: cell structures, charitable facade in poor towns, loyalty through money, and quiet intimidation. Clan del Golfo, Sinaloa affiliates, even Moroccan and Albanian mafias embed in Colombian ports and use his routes to move cocaine via shipping containers to Europe from Antwerp and Spanish ports. But authorities learn too. Intelligence services exchange data, follow blockchain trails, track encrypted comms, monitor vessel movements. DEA-style training courses now include Escobar tactics as negative playbook and policy case study. In Medellín, memory projects keep pace. Former labs become museums. Airstrips now house youth farms or solar co-ops. Exhibits display ledgers, bullet holes, torn shoes, taxidermied hippo skulls, symbols of a legacy identified, studied, not glamorized. Visitors trace bullet-stained walls, follow maps showing flight paths of narco planes, and exit into gardens planted for victims and survivors. Schools teach moral calculus. Ledgers and bombs spring from the same pencil line. Youth draw new street murals, hippoglyphs underlined by phrases like, "We feed him lettuce," "We feed ourselves knowledge." Some guides now lead hippo watch walks, not to celebrate myth, but to teach unintended consequences. One teenage guide says, "These hippos are wild reminders of legacy-made flesh, out of place and dangerous unless managed." Across Latin America, survivors' networks share stories. Victim coalitions in Guatemala, Honduras, Brazil exchange strategies with Colombian families whose relatives died under narco wars. They push governments for reparations, land return, justice initiatives under banners like Resistance Through Memory. Detective teams continue tracing Colombia's legacy. Miami, UK, Spain law enforcement regularly bust new cells linked back to Antioquia routes established in the 80s and 90s. Narco subsurface, crypto wallets are traced, hidden labs mapped, all referencing methods once pioneered by Pablo's network. Colombian youth march forward, but memory stays conscious. Murals scream, not idle, memory. Young coders, agro-entrepreneurs, cafe owners build futures in villas once echoing with gunshots. They ride peace buses painted with murals of victims, not kingpins. Cartels still rise, particularly in remote areas where inequality endures. Farmers plant coca when government aid falters. Children join armed groups when schools shutter. The cycle restarts, but society fights it with stronger institutions, community rebuilding, journalism, and memory preservation. In foggy mornings, elders by Callejon Montoya whisper, "Every empire blooms until its roots rot." They push back hard, forgetting breeds monsters. Remembering allows them to test lines, trace origins, choose different futures. The empire that boy built killed thousands, but the lesson that remains about power, greed, silence, and consequences lives on. In Medellín, when light breaks through mist over hills once silent with fear, the city breathes cautious peace. It remembers, so monsters cannot rise again. The river still remembers the footsteps of those hippos. They slip through reeds near Hacienda Nápoles, silent ghosts of an empire once ruled by fear. What started with 4 creatures brought by a man who wanted control has turned into nearly 200 each, with their own appetite and history across the Magdalena Basin. None of them were planned to survive beyond him, yet they live on. Wild, invasive, echoing legacy. Biologists now estimate up to 181 to 15 hippos roaming free in Colombia, the largest population outside Africa. With no predators, they breed unchecked. Some studies warn their numbers could hit 1/400 by the mid-2030s if controls fail. Their daily dung, up to 9 kilos each, poisons riverbanks, disrupts native fish, capybaras, and manatees. The Colombian government launched plans: sterilize 50 hippos a year, transfer some abroad, possibly cull the rest. The Guardian. Sterilization costs nearly $10,000 per male, requires risky anesthesia by helicopter, and delays drag out ecological damage and public backlash. Lawsuits over animal welfare stall efforts. Diplomats in India, Mexico, the Philippines debate invitations to host 70 relocated hippos. But bureaucracy snarls progress. Traffickers now use narco-subs, semi-submersible boats to cross oceans, and autonomous variants equipped with surveillance gear. One recent bust by Colombian Navy marked the first seizure of a robotic narco-sub, signaling science fiction becoming reality and narcotics smuggling cartel networks are global. Moroccan groups move Colombian cocaine through Antwerp. Albanian mafias in Ecuador funnel through Spanish ports. Sinaloa-linked labs process powder in Europe and Asia. Europe now imports more cocaine than US, yet authorities fight back. Intelligence agencies share blockchain trackers, pirate narco-subs mid-sea, infiltrate encrypted comm channels, map old Antioquia routes, and replicate them in surveillance databases. In Medellín, culture reshapes memory. Old labs become museums. Bullet-scarred walls guide youth tours. Hippo skulls rest in display cabinets beside ledger books scribbled by teenagers who later saw families vanish. Visitors learn about choices that ripple across generations rather than celebrating legend. Kids sit on museum steps eating arepas and listen to survivors recall mothers who lost sons, journalists who vanished for telling truth. They draw murals on former airstrips, replacing runway lines with olive branches, noting, "We feed him lettuce, but we feed ourselves knowledge." One teenage guide says, "Hippos are legacy-made flesh, out of place and dangerous unless managed." Youth groups run Hippo Watch tours, combining leaf feeding with leaflets about invasive species and ecosystem health. Fishermen collect stories of near attacks on the Magdalena River. Guides remind tourists this isn't exotic, it's consequence. Schools teach ethical ecology. Even animals from wealth can damage system. Coalitions of survivors form regional alliances with families in Honduras, Guatemala, Brazil. They push for reparations, land restoration, justice. They demand governments treat memory as policy, not myth. They call themselves resistance through memory, never forgetting the faces lost. Cartels rise again in neglected regions when institutions fade. Coca grows in remote patches. Children join armed groups. Access to services vanishes. The cycle reboots, but now society fights more effectively through journalism, civil society, youth entrepreneurship, and global data-based enforcement. Yet some argue Pablo's model still influences new leaders. Community sponsorship, soccer leagues, clinics, charity in exchange for silence. Law enforcement counters by building strong local democracy, legal aid, audits of aid money, transparency. Elsewhere, detective teams in Miami, London, Madrid still seize containers traced to Antioquia routes, trace DNA of trafficking traced decades later. They monitor blockchain transactions, follow narco-subs, intercept lab chemicals. They use Medellín-style schemata as blueprint, not inspiration. Colombia balances memory and innovation. Medellín hosts innovation hubs, peace festivals, tech startups. Libraries open where labs once buzzed. Young coders create apps for monitoring deforestation. Farmers grow coffee on airstrips. Street artists paint murals demanding justice, not violence. At night, when fog drifts over old roots in hippo pools, elders whisper, "Every empire blooms until its roots rot." Memory holds them steady. Choices matter. The boy with the bicycle built empire on silence and powder, but the country now builds future on voice and choice. History doesn't end when bullets fly. It continues in classrooms, riverbanks, hippo-watched waters, and youth drawing new routes out of ancient darkness. When dawn finds Medellín, the light filters through mist like a soft forgiveness. But beneath that calm are deep currents, survivor stories, survivor voices, quiet, yet unbroken. In barrios where bullets once reigned, mothers now hustle fresh bread beside murals of children lost. Their faces carry lines not just of pain but of endurance. They speak not of legend but struggle, how families rebuilt with nothing but memory and hope. One woman, Marta, lost her husband when he tried to report a kidnapping. She speaks in a small school where students crowd around her. She doesn't ask for pity. She wants truth. She tells them how fear made silence, how silence bred violence, and how breaking silence rebuilt her pride. Children sketch her story on chalkboards, then ask questions. Why did they forget? Why did he hurt so many? Another survivor runs a bookstore in a converted safe house. The walls still bear cracks, echoes of executions. She stocks only one book by Escobar, tucked in a corner. Instead, she fills shelves with memoirs of journalists, police officers, farmers. She says, "We remember not for him, but for those living." Students come and ask for signed copies of stories about those erased by bullets. Young activists form networks across Latin America. They meet online. They hold webinars connecting families in Guatemala, Honduras, Brazil, Colombia. One speaker, a former bodyguard turned teacher, shows photos of children born after tragedy. He says real power is survival of the soul, not the empire. They encourage others to map violence not to glorify it, but to dismantle it. In Hacienda Nápoles, the hippos swim under the brow of early sun. Guides lead tourists now, but this is lesson, not spectacle. They show lettuce feeding, but also share warnings about invasive species. The children in school groups murmur, "These hippos live because he did." They look at massive teeth and scrape drawings in the soil. They ask, how long until they outgrow the river too? Teachers take them to botanical gardens where seedlings grow on old airstrips. They listen to seedling buds cracking through concrete. They learn that nature reclaims faster than men forgot. They learn that the ground breathes again when violence falls silent. Cartels still rise in remote provinces. They find gaps where youth see no options. They recruit in towns starved of opportunities. Yet after local crackdowns, some young recruits find peace initiatives, coding camps, agro-business workshops, trauma counseling, offered by NGOs started by ex-sicarios turned mediators. They listen to ex-fighters confess that violence wasn't power, but emptiness. They apologize to families. They teach that forgiveness rebuilds trust where bullets fractured it. In universities, professors debate ideology. They dismantle the Robin Hood myth. They bring in economic data. He earned millions, yet inequality deepened. They show maps, clinics built and wars hidden behind them. They say the real lesson isn't his rise, it's how a country let him rise. These debates aren't academic. They ripple into policies, land reform, women's shelters, government transparency offices. International NGOs hold youth exchange programs. Kids from Medellín visit Honduras, talk to survivors of journalist killings in Guatemala, see abandoned plantations in Brazil. They connect violence across borders, but also connect resistance. They write letters, pueblo a pueblo, people to people, requests for reparations, for land return, for memorials in towns forgotten by state. Cartels in other countries copy his blueprint, cell structure, local philanthropy, infrastructure sponsorship. But now governments counter with something new: institutional partnerships, rapid school reopening efforts, audit teams watching every peso of community funding. They fight money with transparency, myths with accountability. The hippo population threatens to double again. Young ecologists volunteer to monitor behavior. They use drones to map herds. They speak in town halls. The cost of sterilizing one male is nearly $10,000, but cost of mass failure could be millions. They teach that in every action, money buys loyalty, sometimes with biology rather than bullets. Museums extend tours. Visitors trace ledgers, bullet holes, burned shoes. ledger scribbles beside cash bundles. Then they move into gardens where olive trees grow, planted by victims' families. They read plaques. Memory becomes peace by planting. They carry small saplings out as symbols of new roots. One young poet writes, "My country is a ledger turned garden." He reads to crowds near former labs, now amphitheaters. Kids gather on blankets in the grass, listening as he speaks of soil reclaiming shame, seeds burying fear. They laugh, they cry, they draw murals behind him, hippoglyphs next to olive branches. In Medellin's public transit stations, messages scroll across screens. Power must serve, not conquer. History stays when silence ends. These public whispers reach commuters who glance up, read, and sometimes nod. Language changes. No longer heroizing empire, but holding institutions accountable. Cartels in Mexico, the Caribbean, Africa still transport cocaine via old Antioquia routes. But now intelligence agencies train young detectives with curriculum referencing his tactics, not to praise, but to avoid. They call it negative legacy. They trace narco subs, blockchain wallets, encrypted comm channels. They build task forces with forensic accountants, ethicists, community organizers. Peace building becomes security. Young entrepreneurs launch coffee cooperatives in towns built over labs. They process beans for export. They sell memory blend with labels explaining land history. Part of proceeds funds local schools. They train former recruits to roast and code. They say profit must heal, not harm. Party lights double as candles at remembrance plazas. Every December 2nd, gatherings light flowers at memory walls. Survivors read names he never spoke. They read victims, not himself. Children release floating lanterns in rivers, planting lights on water to honor lost families and anchor hope. Hippos still stun tourists. They splash through lagoons, horns jut from muddy banks. Guides echo, these animals are legacy and risk. Children feed lettuce but also throw pamphlets about environmental impact. They learn ecosystem ethics from raised awareness, not just feeding animals for novelty. Academic conferences now include representatives from African biodiversity councils, hippo rescue specialists comparing invasive species experiences. They ask, what happens when wealth creates wildlife? Who owns consequences? Students learn not only narco history but ecological ethics too. The streets no longer echo bombings, but chatter about innovation. Hackers discuss blockchain, young farmers harvest coffee for export, code camps buzz in former villas. Yet a mural reads, "He built legacy, we build futures." And in those hills, when fog rolls, elders say, every empire blooms until roots rot. Memory holds steady, silence sows ruin. Truth cultivates choice. In Medellín, the city breathes cautious peace. It builds futures not from powder or fear, but from voice and choice. The boy's ledger grew into empire. The country's voice grew into change. The story continues, not in legend, but in conscience. The lesson remains. Imperial silence destroys. Collective memory redeems. The morning mist hugs Medellín's valleys like a second memory. Concrete buildings rise beside parks where clinics once stood. Hippos drift in slow rivers while children play ball nearby. The world feels calm, but beneath that calm, currents of resilience ripple. Families gather in plazas at daybreak. They bring flowers for the memory walls, single petals placed under murals with names of people who vanished, not empire builders. Candles flicker in small votive gardens beside images of victims. They don't shout of nostalgia, they murmur of accountability. In one barrio, a former informant turned teacher leads a walking tour. He points to bullet-holed walls, safe houses turned cafes, airstrips now youth parks. Children ask him if he's the man on the stories. He smiles, says no, just someone who decided not to stay silent. They draw with chalk, maps of transformation, not smuggling. Up in the hills, olive trees planted by survivors rustle in wind. They stand where labs hid in shadows. Teachers bring students there, ask them to close their eyes and imagine growth from destruction. They learn history not as horror, but as soil, something that can nourish or poison depending on what you plant. Cartels still exist. They cobble together roots in remote towns, recruit kids with promises of easy money. Airports are high-altitude farmlands where cocaine is hidden in shipping containers, oils, or treated wood. Pilots fly drones, narco subs cruise below radar. Crypto wallets exchange millions overnight. But societies learned. Governments built stronger courts, investigative units that trace money through shell corporations. NGOs lobby for transparency. Young lawyers file asset recovery cases. Journalists follow digital ledgers. Negative legacy becomes a term, how to stop behaviors copied from empire builders. In Medellín, pop culture changed. Artists paint murals of shattered ledgers, not kingpins. Musicians rap about choice, not trafficking. Poets write lines like, "I planted memory so silence would never bloom." Hippoglyphs appear ghost-like, underlined with text. Legacy, not idle. Street shaders instruct others. Don't glamorize the monster, study the lessons. Memory centers thrive. In former villas, exhibitions show torn notebooks, ledger scribbles, uniforms taken off victims who died younger than their children are now. Visitors trace shipping routes on digital maps. They trace escalations in violence. They trace how money built clinics that masked chaos. They walk through gardens of memorial trees grown beside bullet stones. They learn caution, not celebrity. They see bloom incense coils burning beside olive saplings. Survivor networks span borders. Women in Guatemala, Colombia, Honduras, Brazil meet via video. One reads letters from prisoners turned informants, speaking of regret. Another organizes art workshops for survivors' children in Havana schools. They print leaflets in Spanish, Portuguese. We do not forget. We forgive accountability. They push for reparations, but also for curriculum change, teaching truth instead of myth. Cartel operations elsewhere study him in case studies. Backroom leaders in Colombia recruit loyalty with clinics. In Mexico, they use soccer leagues. In West Africa, they hire pilots to manage airstrips and routes. But governments now audit every paradero donation, every clinic sponsorship. They train auditors, give cash transparency grants to vulnerable towns. They build institutions where presence used to suffice. At coffee festivals in Medellín, vendors sell beans called Legacy Blend, coffee grown on reclaimed airstrips, roasted by former cartel affiliates, now entrepreneurs. The labels speak of redemption, from powder to purpose. They say profits can redeem if aimed at community. Youth groups run ecology tours in hippo territory. Guides explain these animals survived because he wanted control. They show hippo footprints traced into riverside sand. They hand out maps showing wetland imbalances and polluted fish stocks. They talk about invasive momentum, how things planted for power can consume landscapes long after power collapses. Schools assign projects, design a memorial plan, plant a peace garden, calculate cost of sterilizing hippos versus cleaning spills. Kids solve moral calculus. Numbers can build or destroy. One student sketches a mural of half a hippo, half an olive branch. She tacks it in the school hallway with a sign. Choose roots, not ruins. Public buses carry screens scrolling. Power serves or collapses. Speak truth to heal land. Commuters glance up. Smooth daily routes after years of curveballs. Light rail trains hum through valleys that once shook with bombs. Security cameras track packages, not people. Police patrol not to terrorize, but to protect. In law schools, students debate extradition precedents. Professors ask, did immunity under a towered prison undermine justice? They study negotiation with him as deterrence or facade. They write theses on shadow states and reconstruct legal frameworks so immunity won't become loophole. Elders in hills sit on benches. They watch telescopes trained on hippo herds. They whisper, these creatures are part warning, part wonder. If we waited another decade, no rescue. But we rescue memory now. They recite lines. Every empire blooms until roots rot. Night markets glow with colors. Women sell handmade soap labeled Truth Scent. Children sell postcards featuring murals and memory gardens. Tourists ask, why the hippo symbol? Locals say, not tribute. Reminder, nature floods if history forgets. Monthly dialogues gather survivors and ex-combatants. They stand in circle, share voices, share leaflets with statistics. How many ice pick guns were hidden in laboratories? How many surgical sterilizations done on hippos? How many community reinvestments failed? They speak numbers to convict untruths. Cartel alliances still operate globally, but law enforcement maps them in code, Logistica Med style. Task forces span continents, Miami FBI, Europol specially, plus narcotics. They monitor blockchain keys, Shell land ownership, shipping analytics. They work with community watchers in Colombia who track lab rebuilds, ground airstrips, suspicious drones. It's surveillance built on this. Empire won't rise if its blueprint is burned. In art halls, galleries exhibit images of hippo herds in dawn light, olive trees at sunset, young activists burning old safe house doors to create sculptures. A curator says, "We memorialize not his myth, but our reboot." At night, residents release floating lanterns on the river. Little lights drift into the fog, naming people. Journalists, farmers, mothers, police officers, children. People kneel and whisper, "We remember you, not the king." The silenced. The boy's ledger built empire. The country's voice built future. The empire died, but lesson lives. When fog returns to Callejon Montoya, elders say, memory holds, silence destroys, choices build. The story continues, not legend, but conscience. Over time, the hills around Medellín have shifted. Once heavy with helicopters and contraband, they now hum with the light rhythm of entrepreneurship and memory. Cafes bloom in former safe houses, solar panels shimmer where labs drown shadows. Hippos wander rivers watched by guides who carry leaflets instead of weapons. The world seems quieter here, but listening close, you can hear stories rising. People go about their days buying coffee, riding buses named for peace activists, sending kids to schools built on reprieve. Everywhere the legacy holds shape, not as myth, but as mirror. The streets remember. The rivers remember. Even the hippos remember what they didn't know, what they inherited and what they symbolize. Communities gather weekly to tend memory gardens. They plant olive saplings, each labeled with a name. A journalist killed, a teacher lost, a farmer disappeared. They speak aloud, not in defiance, but to anchor history in stories. Young attendees ask, where did fear end? One elderly woman answers, when truth began, not violence. A man who once flew contraband aircraft now travels the country as a storyteller. He speaks in schools and intersection towns. He shows worn flight logs, maps inked with roots, pictures of jungle runways. He talks about the moment he first realized, roots sell powder, but stories sell silence. He warns youth, history doesn't repeat, it ripples, and choice writes its shape. Cartels persist in pockets of remote provinces. They recruit the desperate, kids without opportunity, towns without clinics. They replicate old tactics, sponsor schools, sponsor soccer leagues, bury clinics beside threats. Yet local policies counteract with speed, municipal transparency boards, community cash audits, tracking of funding, youth leadership programs. They try to starve the silence with sunlight. In universities, workshops teach mapping memory. Students trace dealer, chains, trace violence escalations, but also trace remedial paths, therapy centers, restitution programs, mental health mobile units. Professors ask, how do societies rebuild moral calculus after empire? Answers emerge in policies focused on justice and inclusion. Hippos still multiply. Ecology teams chase footprints with drones. Local councils debate whether to relocate or sterilize. Rivers strain under algae blooms caused by hippo dung mid-rains. Schools pilot hippo tracking clubs. Children learn to record behavior, map ranges, propose solutions. They build data skills and ecological ethics. They say, even legacy animals can teach responsibility. In Medellin's art districts, murals flare with color, hippoglyphs underlined with "not idle," ledger lines scribbled beside rooftop gardens, olive-branched forests sprouting from concrete. Poets perform beneath them, lines like, "I planted memory so silence would never sprout again." Children draw beside them, annotate them, photograph them. The murals aren't landmarks but messages. Public buses scroll quotes. Power should serve, not suppress. Memory builds what fear destroys. Commuters glance up, some nod, others wonder. In marketplaces, vendors sell postcards with hippos and olive trees, a contrast of invasive beast and peace sprout. They label them legacy and choice. River cleanup teams meet at dawn. They fish debris and plastic, but also carry floating lanterns to pond corners where hippos drift. They whisper names of victims, seeds of hope planted in water. Oriented to memory, they say, rivers carry stories, not just floods. Tour companies offer walking tours, first the safe house route, then the gardens, then the hippo wetlands, then community cafes. Guides pause at each stop to ask, "What do you see beyond the surface?" They urge visitors to stay silent, not in forgetting, but in listening. Youth-led NGOs run coding and agro startups on former lab lands. They do drone mapping, reset coca fields to coffee fields, revive soil. They host hackathons themed Transmute Legacy. Winners propose apps tracking land use, ghost airplane routes, hippo movements. They say legacy is data, not dollars. Cartel simulation labs in criminology schools model his empire. Students debrief strategies of cell loyalty, of infiltration, of power projection. But they title the module, How to Build a War and How to Prevent One. They present reforms, transparency commissions, rapid response clinics, civic integrity panels. Victim networks across the continent gather yearly. They interview survivors, film testimony, compile directories of names. They distribute leaflets titled, We Remember, featuring portraits, not kingpins. They push for national truth commissions, reparations, legacy gardens. Their war is on forgetting, not violence. In film festivals, independent documentaries screen Super 8 footage of labs burning, families fleeing, small children crying. They contrast with current clips of hippo trails, olive trees, youth forums. Filmmakers say, if we forget what he built, future monsters rise in the same blueprint. Memorial concerts sound under half-destroyed villas. A blues singer stands in rooms once held drugs. She sings, My country's ledger bled into soil. A violin joins. People listen in hush. They bear witness. Night markets glow with crafts made by survivors. Soap bars shaped like olive seeds. Bracelets braided in ledger page colors, candles flickering beside small portraits. Tourists ask, why such symbols? A vendor replies, so beauty grows only after darkness is named. Public policy echoes memory. A statue of a girl planting a tree replaces a statue of power. It stands where once stood a cement pedestal honoring wealth. Children walk past it every morning to school. They say, that's how we replace idols, with care. Legal offices offer legacy case clinics. Students help farmers reclaim land. Journalists recover damages. Families document lost relatives. They form a scaffold of justice over broken memory. They testify in courts citing the past to prevent recurrence. In remote towns where coca still grows, community boards trace how promise of clinics once hid death squads. Now they demand transparency. They hold participatory budgeting sessions, insist on local audits before accepting projects. They show older maps in schools, on one, coca fields, on another, coffee rows, classrooms, new roads. Global task forces use Medellin's case as warning study, pipeline flow, cell structure, political infiltration, how coca money burrowed into governance. But they also teach, when society names past, it builds immune response. Civil society oversight prevents relapse. In the hills above Medellín, one elder plants new olive tree beside Hippo Pond. He says to his granddaughter, "When empire fades, roots remain." She tugs at seedling, asks how long it takes to grow branches. He smiles and says, "Longer than it takes to destroy." She nods. Media channels produce stories, not about felled kingpins, but about heroic mothers demanding courts, ex-recruits turning teachers, villages raising memory gardens. They title episodes, "After Empire, Not Empire." They profile hippo trackers, legacy blend coffee makers, survivor poets, counselor pilots who once served the other side. In Medellín's remodeled sidewalks, QR codes embed in benches. Scan one, and you get testimonies of victims buried beneath, details of lab raids, maps of lab locations under current plantations. Students scan them on phones. History becomes hyperlink, and the city breathes again. Not as blank page, but cautious narrative. It no longer trembles at corridors of power, but hums at corridors of memory. The boy's ledger built empire. The country's voice built future. The empire died, but lesson teaches. When fog rolls over hills once silent with fear, memory holds. Silence sows ruin. Voice opens choice. The story continues, not legend, but conscience. The city lights of Medellín glisten in dusk like cautious sparks. Downtown streets hum with new energy. Coffee carts, startup studios, poetry readings beneath murals. But when night falls over the hills, a hush returns, a memory lull, when the city seems to breathe its own story. In a small courtyard, survivors gather. They sew quilt patches that bear names of the disappeared. Each square is stitched into a tapestry hanging under soft bulbs. People come by to pin their own names to victims they never knew. Their voices rise in gentle rhythm. We remember you. We rebuild from memory. Children seated cross-legged help tie ends, whispering stories of mothers they never met. A former pilot now gives talks at universities. He speaks softly of midnight flights, of weightless pallets in cargo holds, of the moment he saw plantation fields glow at landing. Then he pauses and adds, "All that noise built nothing you could keep." Students scribble notes. They ask, "How did ambition become ruin? How does silence become violence?" He says. It follows the ledger, and the ledger always begins small. Cartels still flourish where hope is thin, in remote valleys where roads end, where schools close before night, where clinics vanish with bribery. They recruit hungry kids with soccer jerseys, free exams, free meals. They replicate legacy patterns, charity that binds loyalty, whispers instead of bureaucracy, fear masked by festivity. But local councils now hold check sessions. Citizen audit brigades track donation receipts and demand transparency in funding. They paint slogans. No clinic built with fear is peace. In sleek cafes inside refurbished safe houses, guides offer hippo tours at dawn. Visitors watch massive creatures drift across river water. Guide hands out leaflets. Hippos survive because power made roots, but those roots threaten nature. Children sketch hippos in notebooks and write beneath, "We feed them lettuce, but we feed ourselves knowledge." They watch the hippo family grow. They learn about invasive imbalance, symbol of unintended consequence. They say, legacy can be animal, landscape, lesson. On nearby reclaimed airstrips, young farmers cultivate coffee. They roast beans in open ovens beneath solar panels. They bottle coffee called Redemption Roast. A label explains transformation. Former lab ground to peace field. Part of profits goes to local schools built on emptiness. They serve the blend at science fairs where students learn about soil recovery and ag technology as justice rebuilding. Community memory projects branch into neighborhoods. One network transforms abandoned villas into literacy hubs. Children read memoirs of women activists, listen to oral histories recorded decades ago. They draw maps of disappearance sites, overlay them on city maps. They trace growth over violence. They show how clinics were built beside landmines. They map disappearance alongside development. Knowledge becomes warning. Political leaders once silent now attend memorial events. They stand before families reading names. They place flowers. They vow transparency reforms. Some are sincere, others wary. But citizens demand action. They file petitions to rename streets from narco figures to victims and advocates. They propose budgets for reparative clinics, mental health centers, truth commissions. They ask, will the ledger rewrite itself, or will memory act? Teachers in schools assign projects, code apps to map hippo movements, build blockchain logs of donations, model drug routes as simulations, but then build virtual response plans. Youth compile rap lyrics about reclaiming space, poems about planting olive branches on old runways, art about hippos as burden and teacher. They voice, memory is power when it's shared, not silenced. In film festivals, directors premiere documentaries, one about a mother who buried soil in the exact spot her home once stood before cartel forces burned it. She planted a tree. The camera focuses on sapling leaves rustling in wind. At the end, she says, they stole our lives, but they can't steal what grows from grief. Audiences gasp, some cry. The power of memory hums in both silence and sapling. Cartel networks in neighboring countries studied the pattern. Charity first, power second. But governments inspired by Medellín learned to insulate. They created civic oversight boards, truth panels, community rangers. They train recidivist labs to blog legal aid instead of cook chemicals. They train ex-recruits to become mentors, not muscle. They show the world a model. Transformation from terror to teaching. Hippo control councils struggle with ethics. Sterilization is costly. Relocation refused by courts. Some demand humane euthanasia. Kids protest in town square. Not murder, management. They petition for international wildlife sanctuaries to host relocated animals. Scientists join them. Together, they build ecological plans and long-term strategies. Politics becomes about ecology as justice. Every December 2nd, rallies unfold across Medellín and regional towns. Remembrance marches, lantern releases on rivers, public concerts at memorial plazas. A choir sings, memory is root, truth is light. Families read names in honor. They don't celebrate a king, they honor the fallen. Children fold paper flowers in boats. They say, we carry light, not legends. Banks now require NGOs and local groups to publish receipts publicly, digitally traceable. Cartel-affiliated clinics once passed cash under tables. Now philanthropy must post accounting to citizen dashboards. Transparency becomes antivirus against legacy tactics. In corridors of justice, lawyers prep cases of land seizures, forced evictions that took place under narco rule. They pin property lines, trace money flows, subpoena ex-officials. Victims reclaim fields once airstrips. They plant crops. They build schools. They sell local coffee beneath banners reading, Land Back, Future Forward. Local media air programs about hippo herd growth. Biologists explain balance, fish die-offs, river pollution. Communities propose floating hippo bridges, eco-watchers, drone tracking. Students contribute code to data apps. They create real-time maps of hippo families moving under cover of night. They say, legacy is data too, and data can save. Social media buzz rolls with youth challenges. Memory garden where kids plant seedlings in memory walls and upload stories. Not Annie Doll, where creators create hippo art with olive symbols. Nail art, stickers, poetry reels, all showing legacy, not royalty. They write captions. We are not repeating, we are rebuilding. International delegations from Latin America, Africa, Asia, visit Medellín for knowledge exchange. They see memory gardens, data apps, transparency programs. They ask, can we replicate this? They return home modeling memory-led policies where drug violence once bloomed. They plant trees in plazas in Haiti, Guatemala, Brazil, symbols of accountability. In labs repurposed into makerspaces, young coders prototype blockchain apps for tracking NGO funds, seedling growth, land titles, hippo movements. They write, legacy blend is code, memory is protocol. Their sponsors? Former lab spaces given to youth, music festivals pulse across renewed plazas. Poets, rappers, folk singers crowd around themes, memory, choice, broken soil, reborn. They rap verses such as, not empire but empathy, not powder but pollen. The crowd chants back, memory over myth. Whenever rain falls over old flight path hills, elders say, the waters remember footprints of plains, rivers, and hippos. But they say louder, the hills remember voices raised. Should another ledger begin, memory will remind. Medellín thrives, not because empire fell, but because society refused to forget. The boys' ledger built empire. The country's voice built future. The empire died, but the lesson lives. Silence sows ruin. Voice opens choice. Legacy becomes lesson, and memory becomes shield. In the echo of dawn mist, the story lives on, not as myth, but as conscience and community. When dawn breaks over Medellín now, there's a softness to the light, as if the fog itself carries stories. In plazas, women set up pop-up stalls selling memorial bracelets and soap bars shaped like ledger pages. Their voices rise softly over the hum of electric scooters and children's laughter. The memory markets hum with purpose, tangible tokens of loss, resilience, and choice. In a refurbished villa turned community center, young mentors hold Map the Memory workshops. Kids crowd around digital tables, tracing old drug routes, identifying former labs, and overlaying new redevelopment data. As they drag route lines, mentors explain how every path once sold powder, but now can sell purpose. A seventh grader projects. We redraw routes so violence can't inscribe itself again. Above them, a mural reads, memory built from the past builds our future. At the river's edge, hippo watchers gather at midday. They observe massive beasts lounge in sun-warmed water. Guides distribute laminated cards with hippo family names, age estimations, and movement zones. Tour groups watch quietly. The lesson isn't spectacle, it's ecological consequence. A boy looks at his chart, then at the hippo and says, growth unchecked becomes invasive. He folds his map as the beast dives under. Elsewhere in the hills, memory quilt circles meet weekly. Survivors, fathers, mothers, siblings, gather under strings of lights. They pass patches from hand to hand. Each patch represents someone erased. They stitch edges together. The quilt becomes both remembrance and promise. That names won't fade, that truth will cover wounds. Former narco pilots speak at technical universities. They set aside flight logs and share equations of economy, logistics, and fear. Then they pause and say, all efficiency ended before redemption started. Students take photos. They ask, why did speed become power? Why did capacity eclipse conscience? 1. Young woman blogs. We will find metrics that promote kindness, not only power. In remote municipalities beyond the city, youth-led budgets decide which local need to meet. Refurbishing a clinic, planting olive trees, building a memorial wall painted with children's art names. They compile receipts and public displays. They stream monthly meetings to city councils via video. They refuse money without oversight. They say, transparency isn't obligation, it's immunity. In coffee barns built on old labs, harvest celebrations debut Day of Memory Coffee. Farmers and community leaders raise mugs and share harvested beans roasted under solar power. They speak, we find solace not in neglecting past, but in redressing it. They launch scholarship funds. Each mug sale helps send a student to university. Arts districts shine with murals of half-painted hippos, olive branches breaking through cement, children playing amid broken buildings reclaimed as parks. A poet stands before a crowd chanting, the ledger was written in fear. We write ours in light. Behind him, youth play soccer in stadiums funded by clinics built on parsed restitution. Hippo data labs buzz in converted shipping containers. High school students track GPS collars on hippos, predicting migration corridors, mapping water contamination risk. In town square, they present charts at community town halls. They answer citizen questions. How many reefs die per hippo poop kilo? What income could come from ecotourism versus damage cost? Their plans propose hippo sanctuaries as jobs, not threats. In radio stations, shows air segments titled Legacy and Olive Branch. Guests include survivors, journalists, youth entrepreneurs. They read letters from victims, present coding pitches from ex-recruits, share reflections on impermanence. A radio host asks, "Can memory be living, not dead?" Listeners text back names of grandparents lost. They urge local councils to say names, not forget them. International delegations arrive from Latin America, West Africa, and Southeast Asia. They tour gardens planted on lab sites, examine coffee roasteries exporting memory blends, attend hippo tracking demos. They ask, "Can we start this back home?" The answer, reclaim land, teach history, build transparency as immunity. They leave with seed packets, olive saplings under labels memory root. Memory gardens flourish, olive trees, peace vines, flowers grown from seeds gathered beneath memory walls. Each tree is tagged, a name, a date, a poem snippet. Children water them every afternoon. They learn growth takes time. They name them Nueva Esperanza, Verdad Crece. Teachers say, hope is not blind, it's rooted. Cartels still exist, as silent franchises across borders. But they face post-narco software detectives. Teams train on how not to fund schools. They create modules to detect when money buys loyalty disguised as clinics. They label it Patronato Trap. Mayors refer grants to oversight councils before acceptance. They pass resolutions. Transparency first. Public buses now carry rotating messages. Speak truth louder than violence. We plant memory so monsters cannot grow. Media screens rotate stories. A former Sicario coding apps. A teacher planting olive seedlings in once rubble. A journalist reading names of disappeared as choir joins the chorus. Universities host seminars. The anatomy of empires built in silence, and how they crumble when memory speaks. They invite policymakers to trace land restitution, extradition, and Truth Commission reforms. They draft recommendations, fund memory clinics, integrate civics and ecology in curriculum, make legacy part of planning. In cine clubs, indie screenings replay footage from faded tapes, villagers fleeing, safe houses raided, dogs barking at midnight flights. Then they fade into current images, gardens, coffee shops, hippo sanctuaries. The editors say, story only ends when memory stops teaching. Grief groups meet monthly under lantern-lit halls. Survivors read names, light candles at memory walls, speak poems of endurance. They begin and close together. We remember you. We rebuild in your name. The silence is sacred, not subservient. Neighbors gather for dialogue circles. One reads, "If we lose memory, we invite echoes of past violence." They pass a microphone. Each person speaks for those lost. Children listen and repeat names softly. Together they share strength from acknowledgement. Hippo observation posts remain. Matted grasses mark paths. Soil shows hoofprints. Teams set up solar monitors to record numbers, track growth patterns, detect river buildup. Each county receives public maps with projections and proposed remediation strategies. Students tweet maps tagged, "Charmed Legacy Tracked." Cartels in distant lands still mirror old structures. Monopoly of violence, whispered charity, invisible allegiance. But governments learned to reject charity without audit, words without record. They trained integrity inspectors, built citizen accounts, enacted open data laws. They say, immunity is not in silence, it's in sunlight. In plazas at dusk, families release floating lanterns into ponds near hippo habitat. Each carries a hand-painted tag, name, age, message. Lanterns drift in orange glow. Children watch colors fade into fog. A mother says, "We light memory into water so memory flows, not drowns." Others nod. Memorial music echoes through open-air amphitheaters built on reclaimed land. Bands perform songs about planting hope, resisting silence, choosing agency. The audience rises at chorus. Memory is not myth, it is map and method. They cheer, not for empire, but for everyone who survived. At City Hall, citizens vote for renaming a boulevard from drug kingpin to victim rights advocate. On unveiling day, a choir sings beneath banners reading, "Truth leads where power failed." Banner artists call it Healing Street. Children decorate it with murals of olive trees sprouting from ledger lines. Data teams converge to produce memory journals, maps of violence and renewal, hippostats, rehabilitation stories, youth-led initiatives. They publish free digital libraries so other cities can replicate the framework. Memory gardens, coffee roasters, oversight councils, youth mapping labs. And so Medellín breathes again, not as blank slate, but as layered narrative. Empire died in force, but memory seeds bloom in its place. Silence sows ruin. Voice offers choice. The ledger wrote violence. The country writes lessons. The boy's empire fell. The city's conscience rose. The story marches on. Not myth, but collective memory. The next morning, Medellín awakens to a gentle murmur rather than a roar. Street vendors set out chairs beneath murals of olive branches and ledger pages. Families stroll past hippo-watched rivers and memory gardens. The city feels anchored by past bones and future blooms. One woman, an activist whose brother disappeared years ago, leads a walking tour. She points to former safe house walls now painted in radiant murals. Each painting reflects symbols, hippo footprints fading into olive trees. Children trail behind her like apprentice historians. She speaks in steady voice. We follow these walls so history speaks, not silences. In co-working cabins built from rusted containers, teenagers code apps that map hippo behavior and monitor clinic donations. They call it data of memory. Each night they collaborate in earbuds, debugging code that syncs GPS collar data with rainfall sensors. Screen glow on their faces. They say they code not for currency, but for conscience. In a quiet barrio, a man who once guarded drug flights now runs a reading circle in a former airstrip. The strip is now a football field, but lines of soccer players thinly trace where planes landed. He reads aloud passages from memoirs written by farmers who lost land. Children raise their hands to ask, "Could a ledger kill more than a gun?" He nods. Violence is ledger written with human lives. Elsewhere in marketplaces, memory quilts hang above stall tables. Shoppers trace names stitched on faded fabrics, names of journalists, teachers, fathers. Quilt makers share stories. Each square is a plea not to glamorize, but to bear witness. One teen says, "I stitch them so the past stitches our future." University halls host seminars on negative legacy. Students work in pairs. One researches rebels, one researches reconstruction. They write papers on how clinics built without oversight become tools of coercion, while gardens planted in memory catalyze cohesion. They debate loudly, but conclude softly. Transparency shields against power's corruption. Hippo watchers gather again at midday. A drone hovers overhead mapping footprints, shaded areas, water contamination zones. Guides hand out brochures claiming, "These animals live on because he did. Legacy unplanned and unwatched." Kids trace hoofprints in sand calendars and calculate how pond depths change with hippo wandering. In schools, students sketch murals on blackboards. One mural shows ledger lines turning into roots, then into branches and flowers. Beneath it, the words "resilience grows here." Teachers lead discussions. How does memory plant hope? When empire falls, do roots follow? Community leaders hold participatory budgeting booths in a plaza. Locals propose projects, planting more olive trees in memory gardens, sterilizing hippos, refurbishing clinics, building transparency dashboards. They list costs. No more hidden deals. They vote in public. Advisors calculate returns in literacy, sanitation, trust. At night, floating lantern ceremonies begin on ponds near hippo waters. Families carry small lights with inscriptions: for peace, for truth, for voices we lost. Lanterns drift together into fog-chilled water. A mother whispers, each light is a memory we send into future. Beside her, children hold hands, eyes bright with acknowledgement. In music festivals, hippo-themed folk songs play. A flute mimics river currents. A drum echoes hoofbeats. Singers chant. We feed them lettuce, but we feed ourselves knowledge. The crowd joins in, clapping. Music becomes ritual for rerouting identity. Not narco-glorification, but cultural healing. At City Council, members unveil a restored boulevard renamed Verdad y Concordia. Instead of murals glorifying empire, benches carry poems from survivors. Children wave flags with hippo sketches next to olive branches. Officials promise oversight grants tied to legacy, not silence. Local radio stations broadcast Legacy Hour, stories from survivors, youth tech demos, hippo tracking updates, spoken word about memory and justice. A host asks callers, "What does memory mean to you?" Listeners call in. One says, "Memory is courage of our streets." Another, "It's promise passed to children." In former cartel villas turned literacy centers, writers hold open mic nights. A doodle artist sketches hippos under a quote, "We bear weight, not legends." A poet writes, "Erased names root in gardens." A rapper narrates, "I coded before knowing codes could build peace." Attendees sit cross-legged, listening. International visitors from Brazil, Guatemala, Mexico plant olive saplings in memory gardens. They exchange seed packets with Colombians. Each seed carries a student's name. When planted, they promise to visit in years to come, watering roots as a bond between memory and nation. Hippo sanctuary councils meet in repurposed shipping containers. Biologists and lawyers finalize protocols, sterilization timeline, relocation possibilities, impact assessment. Citizens comment on community boards. Children draw flyers titled Hippo Map for Peace. They write, "We chart them so they don't chart us." Comic book illustrators create a legacy hero character, half hippo, half child, standing between river and garden. The hero rescues memory, not loot. Schools use the comics to discuss consequence, what grows when silence ends. Public transit, adverts display graphics. Ledger lines breaking into tree shapes, hippo prints turning into olive leaves. Captions read, "Choice over chance, memory over myth." Riders see them and sometimes snap photos for feeds, spreading message wider. At courthouse steps, legal students hold clinics giving free counsel to families filing restitution claims or land recovery cases. They display posters, memory as evidence. They assist survivors tracing property lines, tracking NGO funds, compiling human rights affidavits. In border towns, NGOs address coca replanting. They support farmers in transitioning to coffee, cacao, agroforestry. They install transparency cooperatives ensuring funding can't be diverted or become payment for silence. They teach ledger reading, know whose money comes, where it goes, and who benefits. Cartels in remote zones mimic old tactics, local sponsorship leagues, free schools, quiet threats. But societies fight back with public audits, community reporting apps, youth watchdogs. They call it memory defense mechanism. New members sign pledges, no money without track record. In research conferences on global narcotics, Medellín's case appears as negative example and positive model. Law professors say, legacy built on silence fails. Ethicists say, memory gardens heal. International panels nominate youth-led memory mapping apps for peace prizes. At film premieres, animators show hippo family outside villa reflecting in river, then scene flips to olive forest covering lab ruins. Narrators ask, are legacies predictable, or do we guide them? Audience applauds not the beast, but the forest. They weep quietly. Memory Quilt Collective travels to remote schools teaching banners and stitches. They work with children to mark names from towns where safe houses are now markets. They teach. Memory is cloth that wraps grief, so grief doesn't wrap us. In every neighborhood, elders whisper, every empire blooms until roots rot. But then they add, we carry seeds now. They hand children olive seeds. They say, plant them in memory gardens, because memory grows, silence decays. Medellín pulses with cautious peace, not blank slate, but layered narrative. The empire died in power. Memory grew in purpose. Silence sows ruin. Voice plants choice. The boy's ledger built empire. The country's voice built the future. Story continues, not legend, but conscience. Morning light drifts across Medellín's rebuilt rooftops. Coffee roasters scent the air. Children wave as residents plant olive seedlings in memory gardens. The city feels quiet but alive, anchored by past but rooted in growth. Survivors stand together in plazas at breakfast time. They share food beside murals painted by youth, half hippo, half olive tree images. Each figure stands tall, not in homage but in warning. That legacy exists, choice matters. They smile as street vendors hand out bread with cereal grains, seeds symbolizing memory sowing. In schools, children gather around projection tables tracing old drug routes and new development plans. They ask their teachers, how do we map memory? Teachers reply, we plant it, not bury it. They explain how ledger pages can become promise pages when place is reclaimed and names are spoken. In bikeway cafes, once safe house courtyards, interns host memory brunches. They serve legacy roast coffee and seat guests under ledger-patterned tablecloths. On tables are QR codes linking to testimony archives, hippo tracking apps, youth multimedia projects. Visitors sip and learn. Smell is memory too. And coffee brewed here tastes of reclaimed soil. On riverbanks, hippo trackers monitor herds. They note footprints and water contamination. Children walk with clipboards calculating fish stocks per hippo family. Students ask, can animals teach ethics? They answer, yes, if we watch, not ignore. Community workshops repurpose safe house rubble into mosaic memorial tiles. Survivors press broken glass, shredded notes, ledger fragments into patterns. They tile walkways beneath olive trees. Later, children walk barefoot on them, learning the weight of words, shards of memory, the power of names. A former narco-affiliated pilot now visits villages, telling youth about corruption disguised as charity. He urges them, examine every offer, ask for transparency, refuse silence. Kids nod, placing ledger-styled bracelets on their wrists. One teenager says, true legacy is accountability. Local councils convene anomaly audits for clinics previously built under cartel funds. They demand receipts for medicine, staffing lists, audits open to public. Towns swap data with youth coders. They say, what funds build must serve, not suppress. Where records fail, they plant community gardens in blank spots as symbol of healing. In music spots carved into green hills, bands sing songs about the ledger turning into forest, hippo footprints fading beneath grass. Audiences clap in rhythm. Memory grows, silence falters. Their voices rise in music, not myth. Memory quilt groups compile final patches, this circle of 20 parts. Each square bears a name, date, word, truth, voice, roots, choice. At twilight, survivors hold quilt beneath city lights. People pass quilt squares hand to hand echoing, we carry legacy to share, not to celebrate. They wrap it around statues of olive girls, sculptures planted beside hippo ponds, symbolizing rebirth. Public transit now displays rotating messages. Speak truth. Build peace. We plant memory so monsters cannot sprout. Each ride reminds thousands about legacy of choice. Universities host closing conferences on conscience over empire. Researchers present final iterations of memory mapping apps, hippo tracker dashboards, youth internship placements, memory coffee economies. Speakers say, transition succeeds not when we forget empire died, but when memory thrives. At border towns where coca still grows, youth-led cooperatives trade legacy coffee across borders. They label each package with stories of land recovery. They teach tracking receipts as code for voice. Farmers there say, "The ledger is now transparency, not terror." NGO delegations from Africa and Asia return home with olive saplings, data protocols, quilt instructions. They pledge to build memory gardens, peer-to-peer testimony sharing, youth mentorship forums. They say, memory is not just for Medellín, it's medicine for many. In river ceremonies again, families launch floating lanterns. Names drift across water surface with soft glow. Lanterns cluster near hippo-fed ponds. Light circles spread and melt into fog. A poet whispers, "We light memory into moving water so time flows forward, not backward." Cartel enclaves still exist. Gangs replicate old patterns, sponsorship, silence, loyalty for money. But societies counter with trained youth networks, legal scholars, audit activists, memory cafes. They say, power fails when wall of memory is built across its territory. In art halls, exhibitions showcase leftover hippo tracks cast in resin, olive saplings growing out of old ledgers, QR-linked murals that replay testimony spoken. Visitors walk through corridors titled Trace and Transform. They experience how ledger became roadmap reversed, from dominance to dignity. At night, residents release LED balloons above hippo-watched waters. Lights glow like constellations. Names are projected beneath each one. Victims, survivors, those who remembered. The sky swells with quiet solidarity. People gaze until the lights vanish into stars. Memory teams compile legacy atlas, maps of renewal, hippo distribution, memory gardens, youth tech labs, coffee cooperatives, audit councils. They publish it online for other cities to replicate. They say, empire's roots mapped devastation. Memory's routes map reconstruction. And so Medellín stands not as blank slate, but layered tapestry. Empire collapsed in fireworks. Memory blossomed in gardens. Silence sowed ruin. Voice plants choice. The boy's ledger built empire. The nation's voice built future. The empire died, but lesson lives on, not in myth, but in memory. And memory in motion, in city streets, in hearts rooted deep.